Welcome to the Night Library Archive. Tonight, it's time to leave the noise of the world and the busy thoughts of the day at the doorstep. In the quiet corridors of our archive, we are opening a new chapter just for you. You are about to embark on a journey that transcends time, a journey designed to rest your soul. You are safe, you are comfortable, and now, you only hear the rhythm of my voice and the soothing atmosphere around you. Now, adjust your pillow. Pull up your blanket, and gently close your eyes. Our story begins, and you are drifting toward the most peaceful shores of sleep.
The chain rattles, a jagged, rhythmic scream of iron against iron that echoes up the throat of the shaft until it's swallowed by the fog. We are descending now. The cage is a narrow, skeletal thing, a crate of rusted bars and wet timber, and we are packed into it like cattle destined for a ghost market. My shoulder is pressed against the damp wool of a man I've known for 10 years, yet in this shivering half-light, he is nothing but a shape, a presence defined by the smell of stale sweat and the sour tang of morning ale. The circle of the sky above is shrinking. A moment ago, it was a wide, pale gray eye watching us leave the world of the living. Now, it is a silver coin, then a pinprick, and then, with a final, mocking flicker, it vanishes. The darkness doesn't just fall, it rises. It rushes up from the gut of the earth to meet us, thick and heavy, tasting of copper and ancient, rotted stone. You can feel the weight of it first in your ears, a mounting pressure that makes the head throb, and then in your chest. Somewhere above us, there are fields of damp grass and trees stripped bare by the winter wind, but down here, those things cease to be real. They are myths we told ourselves while we stood in the freezing pre-dawn mud, waiting for the whistle. Now, there is only the descent. The air begins to change, losing the crisp bite of the surface and taking on a suffocating, humid warmth. It's a heat that doesn't come from a fire, it's the feverish breath of the deep earth, trapped and stagnant for 1,000,000 years. The walls of the shaft slick past us, inches from my elbow. I can hear the groundwater weeping through the brickwork, a constant, rhythmic drip hiss that sounds like a long, slow inhalation. My boots are already heavy with the sludge at the bottom of the cage. Every few fathoms, the mechanism jolts, a sickening drop that sends the stomach into the throat, reminding us that we are suspended by a single, fraying thread of human engineering over an abyss that has no bottom. The silence among us is absolute. No one speaks. To speak would be to admit the terror of the crush. We all feel it, the sensation of 3,000 feet of rock, soil, and graveyard pressing down on the crown of the head. It's a physical load, a phantom burden that bows the spine before the first basket of coal is even filled. You learn to breathe shallow here. If you take a full lungful, you realize how little of it is actually air. It is a soup of stone dust and the ghosts of men who breathed it before you. The temperature climbs. My skin begins to prickle with a greasy sweat that won't evaporate in this dampness. It just sits there, mixing with the fine black powder that already coats the cage bars. I reach out and touch the timber, and it feels like slick, cold skin. We are sliding down the gullet of a beast that doesn't know it's swallowing us, or perhaps it knows all too well. The light from the few candles fixed to our caps is a pathetic, stuttering orange. It doesn't illuminate the darkness, it only serves to show how dense the blackness really is. It reflects off the wet eyes of the men around me, turning them into a circle of flickering, subterranean sparks. We are no longer husbands, or sons, or neighbors. We are shadows moving through a kingdom of soot. The cage slows. The screaming of the chain transitions into a low, guttural groan. A dull thud vibrates through the soles of my feet as we hit the bottom. The gate screeches open, and for a second, the darkness beyond the cage seems to lean in, curious and hungry. This is the level. This is where the world ends. The air here is different, it's older. It smells of sulfur and the wet, metallic tang of the pickaxes waiting in the galleries. I step out, and my boots sink into the thick, black mire of the floor. There is no horizon here. There is only the low, jagged ceiling of the tunnel, so close I have to tilt my head to keep my cap from scraping the rock. The walls are closing in, sweating beads of mineral-stained water that look like blood in the candlelight. I can hear the distant, hollow tink-tink-tink of a hammer from a mile away in the deeps, a lonely sound that underscores the vastness of the tomb we've just entered. The weight of the mountain is on us now. It's a silent, patient pressure, waiting for a single timber to rot or a single pillar to crack. I adjust the strap of my lamp, the flame dancing precariously, and look down the long, narrowing throat of the main gallery. The darkness there is absolute, a solid wall of velvet black that swallows the light after 10 paces. My lungs hitch, reacting to the first taste of the grit. It's a dry, peppery sensation at the back of the throat, the promise of the cough that will eventually claim us all. But for now, there is work. There is the coal. The black gold that demands our blood as a tithe. I turn away from the shaft, away from the memory of the sky, and begin the long, hunched walk into the heart of the pressure. The silence of the deep is waiting, broken only by the sound of my own wet footsteps and the labored, rhythmic pulse of the earth. The transition from the cage to the face is not a walk, it is a slow, rhythmic folding of the body. Here, the ceiling, the roof of our shared grate, stoops down to meet us, forced low by the unimaginable burden of the hills above. I feel the rough, weeping shale scrape against the wool of my jacket, a tactile reminder that there is no space here for a man to stand tall. To be a miner is to forget the vertical world, to learn the language of the crouch and the crawl, until your spine takes on the permanent curve of the tunnels themselves. The air in this heading is thicker than it was at the shaft's foot. It is stagnant, a heavy soup of discarded breaths and the sour, invisible exhalations of the coal seam. My lamp flickers, a tiny, fragile heartbeat of orange light that barely cuts through the gloom. It casts long, distorted shadows of my limbs against the jagged walls, making me look like some many-legged insect scurrying through a crack in the cellar of the world. Every few yards, a timber prop groans a low, visceral wood scream that vibrates in the marrow of my bones. They tell us the wood speaks to warn us, but to me, it sounds like a long, slow surrender. I reach my stall, a narrow slit in the blackness where the seam thins out like a dying vein. To get to the coal, I must lie on my side in the slack and the cold, alkaline water. The mud here is a fine, silicious paste that works its way into every pore, under every fingernail, and into the very grain of the skin. I can feel the grit of it between my teeth, a constant, grinding reminder of the mountain's resolve to consume us. I take up the pick, its handle slick with the grease of 100 shifts, and the first blow is a dull, muffled thud that jars my elbows and sends a shudder through my teeth. The coal is stubborn today. It clings to the earth with a prehistoric tenacity. With every swing, a cloud of fine, obsidian dust erupts, hovering in the dead air before settling into my hair, my eyes, and my throat. I try to breathe through a rag, but the fabric soon becomes a sodden, black mask that makes me feel as though I am being slowly smothered by a wet hand. There is no rhythm here, only the relentless, mechanical repetition of muscle against stone. Swing. Impact. Shiver. Breathe. The dust tastes of ancient forests and rot, a dried bitterness that parches the tongue and turns saliva into a thick, black ink. My lantern is my only companion, and it is a fickle one. It reveals only what is inches from my face, the gleaming, faceted surface of the coal, the silver trails of water weeping from a fissure, and the pale, translucent spiders that scurry away from the heat. Beyond that small circle of light lies a darkness so absolute it feels like a physical weight against the back of my neck. It is a predatory dark, one that waits for the oil to run dry or a sudden gust of damp air to snuff the flame. To be in the deep without light is to be erased. You lose the sense of where your body ends and the rock begins. As I work, the silence of the mind begins to play tricks. Between the strikes of my pick, I hear the drip, drip, drip of the feeders, a sound so steady it begins to feel like a clock ticking down the seconds of my life. Sometimes, I swear I hear the mountain shifting, a deep, subterranean grumble like a giant turning in its sleep. It is the sound of the earth adjusting to the void I am carving into its belly. I am a thief, stealing the black heart of the world, and the world is constantly trying to heal the wound by crushing the surgeon. My muscles are beginning to burn now, a slow, spreading fire in the shoulders and the small of the back. The cramp is a familiar ghost, tensing the calves and locking the fingers into a claw-like grip around the pick heft. But there is no room to stretch, no space to stand and shake out the exhaustion. I am wedged in this horizontal coffin, my world reduced to a 3-foot height and the reach of my arms. I can hear the muffled, rhythmic thumping of the other men in distant stalls, a chorus of invisible toil that echoes through the pillars. We are all alone in our own private darkness, connected only by the shared frequency of our labor and the common knowledge that the sky is a dream we can no longer afford to believe in. I stop for a moment to wipe the sweat from my brow, but my hand only leaves a fresh smear of soot across my eyes. The sting of the salt and the grit makes them water, and for a second, my vision blurs. In that blur, the tunnel seems to shrink, the walls leaning in just a fraction closer. The air feels thinner, used up, as if the coal itself is breathing what little oxygen remains. I lean my forehead against the cold, wet face of the seam and listen. I listen to the heartbeat of the pit, the creak of the wood, the weeping of the stone, and the distant, tragic braying of a pony somewhere in the main gate. The mountain is heavy, so very heavy, and I am just a speck of dust beneath its heel. The pick falls from my hand, the iron head thudding into the soft, black slack between my knees, and for a moment, I simply exist in the silence. But it is never truly silent. The mine has a voice, a low, subsonic vibration that hums through the soles of my boots and the marrow of my shins. It is the sound of the earth's immense, indifferent patience. I reach for my lamp, my fingers trembling with a fatigue that feels like liquid lead in my veins, and I turn the wick. The flame sputtered, a dying gasp of yellow that stretches my shadow across the jagged roof. In this flickering half-light, the shadows are not mere absences of light, they are heavy, living things. They coil into the hollows of the gob, the waste-filled voids behind us, and they dance with a deceptive, mocking agility. I watch my own reflection on the wet shale, a distorted, blackened specter that mimics my every move. If I lean left, the shadow lunges right, its head merging with the jagged cracks in the stone until it looks like a creature with 1,000 shifting faces. You learn quickly not to stare too long into the corners of the stall. The mind, starved of the sun and fed on a diet of soot and dread, begins to carve shapes out of the gloom, faces of men lost in the 32 explosion, or the pale, reaching hands of the mountain itself. I shift my weight, and a sharp, crystalline crack echoes through the gallery. My heart hammers against my ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage of bone. I freeze. I hold my breath until my lungs burn, listening for the follow-up, the telltale patter-patter of small stones that heralds a roof fall. But there is only the drip of water. Drip. 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 It is the sound of time leaking away, one cold drop at a time, landing in a pool of orange, iron-stained sludge near my hip. The water here is bitter, a chemical brine that eats at the leather of my boots and turns the scratches on my hands into angry, weeping sores. I reach out to touch the pillar beside me. It is a massive block of coal left behind to hold up the world, but under my palm, it feels alarmingly fragile. It is sloughing off in thin, wafer-like shivers, shedding its skin under the pressure of the strata. They say the mountain is always trying to close the wound we've torn in its side, and standing here, wedged into this 3-foot gap, I can feel the truth of it. The ceiling isn't just a ceiling, it is a ceiling of millions of tons, a weight so incomprehensible that it flattens the imagination. My shoulders ache with a phantom load, as if I am personally bracing the rock, my spine the only thing preventing the sky from meeting the floor. The air has grown even more stagnant. It tastes of old iron and the faint, sweetish rot of the timber props that have stood in the damp for too long. I try to clear my throat, but the phlegm is a thick, charcoal paste that sticks to the roof of my mouth. I swallow, and it's like swallowing sandpaper. I think of the boys, the trappers, sitting in the absolute dark by the ventilation doors, miles back in the labyrinth. They sit there for 12 hours in the pitch, their only job to pull a string when a tub passes, listening to the same drips, the same groans of the earth, their young minds becoming as gnarled and soot-stained as the coal itself. At least I have my pick. At least I have the violent, numbing rhythm of the strike to drown out the sound of my own thoughts. I lift the pick again. The handle is sticky with a mixture of sweat and the fine, greasy dust that coats everything. I strike the face, and a spark flies, a brilliant, momentary diamond of light that vanishes as quickly as it appeared. It is a reminder of the danger we cannot see. Somewhere in these galleries, the fire damp is sleeping. It is an invisible, odorless ghost, a gas that seeps from the coal like a silent curse. If it meets the flame of my lamp in the right measure, the world will turn into a roar of fire and flying stone. We live by the grace of a flickering wick and a prayer to a God who surely cannot see us this far down. The rhythmic clack-clack of my labor begins to feel like a hypnotic spell. With every swing, the world outside, the smell of rain on a dusty road, the sound of a bird in a hedge, the warmth of a woman's hand recedes further into the realm of impossible dreams. Those are the things of the light. Here, there is only the grit, the damp, and the narrowing of the spirit. I am no longer a man. I am a tool of the coal, a creature of the dark, burrowing deeper into a tomb of my own making. My knuckles are raw, the skin worn away by the constant friction against the rock, but I don't feel the pain. The cold has numbed everything but the core of my exhaustion. I stop to listen again. From far off, through the maze of pillars and headings, comes a low, rhythmic thumping. It's the sound of the pumps, the great iron hearts of the pit, struggling to suck the water out before it drowns us all. It is a mechanical, soulless sound, a reminder that we are only allowed to be here as long as the machines keep the Earth's blood at bay. I look at my lamp. The oil is low. The circle of light is shrinking, pulling back toward the wick, surrendering the ground to the shadows. I must keep moving. I must keep cutting. Because if I stop, the silence will become a weight I cannot lift, and the darkness will finally realize I am small enough to be swallowed whole. The handle of the pick has become a part of my anatomy, an extension of bone and tendon that I can no longer fully release. When I try to uncurl my fingers, the skin resists, sticking to the wood with a tacky mixture of dried blood and coal tar. My palms are no longer flesh, they are a landscape of yellowed horn and deep, black-rimmed fissures. These calluses are the armor the body builds when it realizes the soul has no intention of leaving the dark. They are thick and sensitive, and yet they throb with a dull, rhythmic heat that matches the pulsing of the temple. Every strike of the iron against the seam is a shockwave that travels up the radius and ulna, settling into the shoulder blades like a nesting parasite. Clack. Shudder. Clack. The vibration is a physical language, telling me the density of the wall, the presence of a hidden slip in the rock, or the hollow warning of a gas pocket. But today, the coal is like iron. It doesn't shatter, it groans and yields only the smallest of chips, sharp as obsidian, which fly back to cut my cheeks. I feel the warm trickle of blood, but it is quickly dammed by the soot, forming a crust that feels like a second, tighter skin. The sound of the work is a sensory claustrophobia all its own. In the narrowness of the stall, the ringing of the pickaxe is magnified, bouncing off the floor and the roof until the air itself seems to vibrate with a metallic scream. It is a constant, piercing frequency that leaves a permanent hum in the ears, a pit song that follows me even into sleep. I can hear the others now, the invisible choir of the damned. To my left, 100 yards through the solid pillar, there is the slow, heavy thump of a man using a crowbar to pry a massive slab loose. To my right, the frantic, high-pitched tink-tink-tink of a boy chipping at the underwood. We are a machine made of meat and desperation, synchronized by the need to fill the tubs before the shift bell. I look at my hands in the failing light of the candle. They are stained so deeply that no amount of scrubbing with caustic soap will ever find the white of the skin again. The coal dust has tattooed itself into the very pores, a permanent mourning dress for a life spent beneath the roots of the grass. The joints are swollen, the knuckles looking like gnarled knots on a drowned branch. There is a specific kind of agony in the thumbs, a sharp, stabbing protest every time I reset the grip. But the pick must move. If the pick stops, the cold moves in. If the pick stops, the silence becomes loud enough to drive a man to his knees. The dampness of the floor has soaked through my trousers, and the friction of the wet cloth against my thighs has rubbed the skin raw. It's the pit rot, a chafing that turns into a burning rash, aggravated by the salt in my sweat. I shift my weight, trying to find a dry patch of shale, but there is none. The floor is a sponge of mineral-heavy sludge. I can feel the grit working its way into my boots, grinding against the soles of my feet with every shove of the shovel. It is a slow, methodical sanding of the human form. We are being ground down, atom by atom, into the very dust we are paid to extract. The rhythm of the labor begins to take on a hypnotic, soul-crushing quality. I no longer think of the basket, or the tonnage, or the pittance of coin that awaits at the end of the fortnight. I think only of the next inch. The next strike. The way the light catches the oily sheen of the coal, reflecting a rainbow that shouldn't exist in a place this devoid of beauty. It is a cruel joke of nature that this black, suffocating rock should hold the colors of a sunset I haven't seen in 14 hours. I pause to breathe, leaning my weight against the cold, unyielding face. My chest heaves, but the air is so thin it feels like trying to inhale through a wet wool blanket. The smell is a suffocating blend of horse manure from the pony runs, the metallic tang of the tools, and the heavy, sweet scent of black damp, the air that has had the life squeezed out of it. My head swims. The flickering shadows on the wall seem to slow down, stretching out like long, dark fingers reaching for my throat. I am so tired that the rock begins to look soft, like a pillow of velvet. I could lay my head down here, in the muck and the grit, and let the mountain have its way. But then, from somewhere far up the drift, comes the sound of a heavy chain rattling and the sharp, echoing crack of a whip. The tubs are moving. The world is demanding its tribute. I tighten my clawed fingers around the pick haft, the pain flare up in my wrist acting as a jagged wake-up call. I am not a man. I am a lever. I am a gear. I am the fuel that feeds the fire of a world I am no longer allowed to inhabit. I raise the pick, my muscles screaming in a silent, internal roar, and I drive the iron back into the heart of the dark. The pick slows, not because the coal has softened, but because the air itself has grown thick with a weeping, mold-scented dampness that sticks to the back of the throat like wet velvet. Down here, the water doesn't just fall, it breathes. It exhales from the pores of the shale, a cold, mineral-heavy sweat that tastes of ancient burials and iron. Every surface is slick with it. The timber props, once sturdy trunks of oak and pine, are now furred with a ghostly white fungus, a subterranean moss that thrives on the absence of light. It looks like the pale hair of a drowned man, swaying ever so slightly in the stagnant draft of the ventilation. I lean my shoulder against the wall, and the rock feels horribly soft, as if the mountain is liquefying under its own immense pressure. The dampness has a smell that stays with you long after you've ascended, a cloying, earthy rot that suggests the world is slowly reclaiming everything we've built. It's in my clothes, which have long since ceased to be dry. The wool of my shirt is a heavy, sodden weight that chafes against my neck, leaving a ring of raw, salt-stung flesh. There is no warmth in this moisture. It is a biting, persistent chill that seeps through the skin and settles into the joints, turning every movement into a calculated negotiation with pain. The weeping of the walls is the only clock we have. Drip. Splash. Drip. The sounds are magnified in the low-ceilinged crawl space, echoing with a wet, hollow metallic ring. Sometimes the water comes in a trickle, a silver thread of groundwater that has traveled through miles of limestone and clay just to find this little pocket of misery. I watch a droplet gather on the edge of a jagged rock above my eyes. It hangs there, trembling, reflecting the tiny orange spark of my lamp like a distorted crystal ball, before it falls and hits my cheek with the force of a needle. It's not just water, it's the mountain's blood, cold and indifferent, washing the soot into my eyes until the world turns into a stinging, gray blur. I look down at my boots, half buried in the sump, the black, oily pool that gathers at the lowest point of the face. The water is opaque, hidden under a thin film of iridescent coal oil that swirls in mesmerizing, sickly patterns. Somewhere beneath that surface are my feet, numb and distant, feeling like blocks of wood. We work in this soup for 12 hours at a stretch, our skin wrinkling and turning it translucent, ghostly white beneath the grime. The pit shivers start in the belly and radiate outward, a rhythmic trembling that I can only stop by swinging the pick again, forcing the blood to move through my stiffening limbs. The psychological weight of the damp is perhaps heavier than the rock itself. It creates a sense of rot, not just of the body, but of the spirit. You begin to feel as though you are dissolving, as though the boundaries between your flesh and the wet earth are fading. The mold on the timbers seems to grow as you watch, a slow-motion explosion of life in a place meant for death. I see a patch of it near my lamp, filaments of silver white stretching out like the fingers of a nervous ghost. I reach out and smear it with a blackened thumb, and it leaves a streak of slime that smells of a cellar that hasn't been opened in 100 years. Far off, I hear the sound of the clackers, the wooden valves of a hand pump being worked by a boy no older than 7. He is fighting a losing battle against the rising tide of the deep. If the pumps stop, the gallery will fill, inch by agonizing inch, until the air is squeezed against the roof and the last candle flickers out in a hiss of steam. We live on the edge of a great, dark lake that sits just behind the rock, waiting for a single misplaced strike of the pick to burst through and claim us. The dampness is its scout, its silent messenger, telling us that the water is patient and the water is hungry. I wipe my face with the back of my hand, but I only succeed in plastering a wet clump of coal dust across my forehead. My breath comes in ragged, humid gasps. The air is so laden with moisture that it feels as though I am drowning while standing up. I look at the seam, the black, glistening face of the coal, and I see my own reflection for a fleeting second in a wet facet. I don't recognize the man staring back. He is a creature of the mud, a gargoyle carved from soot and sorrow, with eyes that have forgotten the shape of a cloud. The pick feels heavier now, the iron head pulling toward the sludge. The rhythm of the work is broken by a fit of coughing, a deep, wet rattle that brings up the taste of copper and grit. I lean my head against the weeping wall, feeling the cold vibration of the earth, and for a moment, I close my eyes. But even in the dark of my eyelids, I see the mold growing, the water rising, and the shadows leaning in to see if I'm still breathing. The rhythm of the pick is interrupted not by a sound, but by a presence, a low, heavy huff of breath that cuts through the stagnant humidity like a ghost. I turn my head, my neck clicking with the protest of cramped vertebrae, and see the silhouette of a shadow within the shadows. It is Barnaby, the pit pony, a creature whose world has shrunk to the width of the main gangway and the length of a hempen lead. He stands there in the passage, his coat a matted tapestry of coal dust and dried sweat, his head hanging so low that his velvet nose nearly touches the black sludge of the floor. There is a tragic, absolute silence to the ponies. They do not whinny for the sun, they have forgotten what the sun is. Born in the flickering orange glow of a stable carved from shale, or lowered down in a net while still young and terrified, they live their entire lives in a kingdom of tactile sensations. To Barnaby, the world is the scrape of the heavy wooden tub against his hocks, the taste of dry, dusty oats, and the stinging crack of a whip that tells him the load is heavy but the mountain is heavier. I reach out a hand, a claw of blackened bone and horn, and press it against his flank. I can feel the heat radiating off him, a living, pulsing furnace in this tomb of cold stone. His skin twitches, a ripple of muscle under a layer of grit, but he does not move. His eyes are the most haunting thing in the deep. When the light of my lamp catches them, they don't reflect back like a cat's, they are vast, milky orbs of sorrow, clouded by the pit blindness that eventually claims every living thing down here. He moves by memory and by the feel of the rails beneath his hooves. He knows every dip in the floor, every low-hanging timber that threatens to scalp him, and every turn that leads deeper into the labyrinth. He is a mirror of us all, a beast of burden whose spirit has been ground into the slack, until the only thing left is the mechanical instinct to pull until the heart stops. I hear the hurrier behind him, a boy no older than 12, his breath coming in ragged, whistling sobs as he leans his weight against the back of the coal-laden corf. The boy doesn't speak to the pony, and the pony doesn't protest the weight. They are locked in a silent, grim partnership of gravity and muscle. The harness creaks a slow, agonizing groan of leather and iron as Barnaby leans into the collar. The muscles in his haunches bunch and quiver, his hooves slipping for a desperate second in the slick mire before finding purchase on a sleeper. Clack squelch. Clack squelch. The sound of their departure is a rhythmic funeral march, receding into the black throat of the tunnel until the only thing left is the smell of wet fur and the lingering warmth of his breath. It is the silence they leave behind that hurts the most. It reminds me that down here, voice is a luxury. We save our breath for the lungs, for the struggle to filter the soot from the air. To scream would be to invite the dust to settle deeper into the bronchial tubes. So we work in a world of muted thuds and metallic rings. Even the ponies seem to understand the economy of the deep. They don't waste energy on a neigh or a stomp. They simply endure. I think of the fields above, where horses run until their lungs are full of clover-scented air, their manes catching the golden light of a July evening. That world feels like a lie told by a cruel god. Here, the only light is the dying spark on my cap, and the only green is the pale, sickly mold on the rotting beams. My hand still feels the vibration of the pony's heartbeat. It was a fast, frantic thing, a tiny hammer drumming against the ribs of the world. I wonder if he dreams of the surface, or if his dreams are just more tunnels, more tubs, and the endless, velvet dark. I suspect the latter. The mind doesn't just take your strength, it colonizes your imagination. It replaces the memory of the horizon with the reality of the face. It replaces the sound of the wind with the groan of the strata. I turn back to the coal, the pick feeling like a leaden weight in my grip. The presence of the pony has made the stall feel smaller, the ceiling lower. I am jealous of his blindness. He no longer has to see the walls closing in, or the way the dust dances in the light like a swarm of black insects. He only has to feel the pull. I raise the pick once more, my knuckles screaming as they lock around the wood. I strike, and the sound is a flat, lonely note in the vast, indifferent gut of the mountain. The pony is gone, the boy is gone, and I am left with the cold, the silent, ancient master that demands we all become shadows before we are even dead. The pickaxe does not merely strike the coal, it rings through the skull, a high, piercing chime that never truly fades. In the narrow confines of this stall, the sound has nowhere to go. It bounces off the floor of jagged shale and the ceiling of unyielding stone, folding over itself until the air is a vibrating lattice of noise. Tink, tang, thud. Each blow is a needle of sound driven into the ear canal. After hours in the deep, the rhythm stops being something you do and becomes something you are. My heart, laboring under the strain of the dust-choked air, seems to synchronize its beat with the strike of the iron. This constant ringing begins to warp the very fabric of time. In the world above, time is measured by the movement of the sun, the lengthening of shadows across a porch, or the fading of the light in a kitchen window. Down here, there is no dawn and no dusk. There is only the count of the strikes. I find myself counting them without meaning to 1,000, 2,000, 4,000 blows until the numbers lose their shape and become a senseless chant in the back of my mind. Is it midday? Is it midnight? Has the sun already set on the world of the living, or are my children just now waking to a breakfast I will never share? The mind is a thief of hours, a place where a minute can stretch into an eternity of straining muscle, and a whole day can vanish into the hypnotic repetition of the pick. I stop for a breath, and the sudden absence of the ringing is more jarring than the noise itself. The silence rushes back in, but it isn't a true silence. It is a thick, pressurized void that makes my ears pop and my head swim. In that stillness, I hear the echo men, the phantom sounds of picks working in galleries that were sealed off 50 years ago. My mind, desperate for a melody or a word, begins to pull music out of the ambient groans of the earth. I hear the distant, ghostly chime of church bells and the weeping of the walls. I hear the murmur of a crowd and the hiss of the ventilation. It is the first sign of the pit madness, the slow unraveling of the senses when they are starved of everything but the dark and the din. My pick hits a pocket of harder stone, a brass or a knot of iron parites, and the sound changes to a sharp, discordant scream. A shower of sparks illuminates my hands for a fraction of a second, white-hot diamonds that die before they hit the muck. The vibration from that strike is a physical assault. It travels up my arms and settles behind my eyes, a jagged spark of pain that makes the world tilt. I lean my forehead against the damp coal, feeling the heat of my own skin against the ancient cold of the seam. The ringing in my ears continues, a persistent, high-pitched sea that feels like a thin wire being pulled tighter and tighter through my brain. The men in the next stall are working in a different tempo. Their strikes are heavy, slow, and rhythmic, a funeral drum to my frantic, staccato chipping. We communicate through this noise. A sudden silence from a neighbor is a cause for dread. It means the gas has found him, or his lungs have finally shuddered. A frantic, rapid tapping is a signal of distress, a plea sent through the solid rock. But mostly, we just ring our bells of iron, signaling to the mountain that we are still here, still breathing, still defiant. I look at the pickhead. The point is dulling, the sharp edge of the morning now rounded by the relentless friction of the earth. It is a mirror of my own body. We come down here sharp, upright, and hopeful, and the mind slowly blunts us. It rounds our shoulders, dims our eyes, and softens our bones until we are as weathered as the timber props. I spit into the dust a black, viscous glob that is swallowed by the shadows and reset my grip. The calluses on my palms moan at the friction, but I ignore them. The rhythm must resume. Without the noise, the darkness becomes too heavy to bear. The sound of the pick is the only thing that proves I am still a man of substance and not just another shadow merged with the wall. I raise the iron, my muscles screaming in a silent, internal echo of the mountain's groan, and I bring it down. Tink! The ring returns. The time-lost world of the deep settles back into its jagged, mechanical groove. I am the clockmaker of my own misery, counting the seconds in sparks and stone. The light is dying, but not for lack of oil. I watch the flame on my lamp with a mounting, hollow dread. It has begun to change, shrinking away from the wick and turning a sickly, ghostly blue. It doesn't flicker with the draft, it cringes. This is the black damp, the heavy, invisible breath of a mountain that has run out of life. It is air that has been stripped of its spirit, a silent pool of nitrogen and carbonic gas that settles in the low pockets of the workings like a flood of invisible water. It does not announce itself with a smell or a sound. It simply waits for you to dip your head low enough to be swallowed. I feel a sudden, leaden heaviness in my limbs, a lethargy that is deeper than mere exhaustion. My heart begins to thud against my ribs, not with the sharp strike of the pick, but with a slow, panicked labor, like a bird trying to fly through honey. The air tastes flat, metallic, and strangely sweet, a flavor that coats the tongue and makes the back of the throat feel as though it's closing. I try to take a deep breath, but my lungs find nothing to hold on to. It is the sensation of drowning in a room that looks perfectly dry. I reach out to the wall for support, and my fingers slip against the weeping shale. The world is beginning to tilt, the jagged lines of the coal seam blurring into a hazy, charcoal smear. The flame shrinks further, now nothing more than a tiny, trembling pinprick of light. I know the rule: when the light fails, the man follows. If the candle goes out, the air is gone, and I will be left here, a statue of soot slumped in the slack, until the next shift finds my cold shell. I move to stand, to lift my head into the higher air where the oxygen might still linger near the roof, but the simple act of rising feels like lifting the weight of the entire world. My knees are water. The darkness at the edges of my vision is no longer just the absence of light, it is a thickening, pulsing veil that hums with the sound of my own thundering pulse. I watch a spider on the timber prop. It stops moving, its delicate legs curling inward as it succumbs to the invisible tide. There is a terrible, quiet dignity to the way the mind kills. It doesn't always need a roar of fire or a mountain of falling rock. Sometimes, it just stops giving you what you need to live. I can hear my own gasps now, short, frantic wheezes that echo on the low ceiling. I am a man standing in a graveyard, realizing the soil has already been thrown over my head. With a desperate, trembling hand, I reach for my pick, not to work, but to use as a cane. I must move toward the main intake, toward the distant, whistling draft of the ventilation doors. Every inch is a battle of will against the creeping slumber of the gas. The shadows seem to sense my weakness. They lean in closer, the blue tint of the dying flame casting my hands in a ghoulish, translucent hue. I look like a corpse already, skin gray beneath the black dust, eyes wide and searching for a ghost of a breeze. The silence is absolute now, save for the rhythmic, what rasp of my own struggle. The bells of the other picks have stopped, or perhaps they are just too far away to reach me through the fog of my own fading senses. I think of the sky not as a memory, but as a physical ache. I imagine a single, cold gust of November wind hitting my face, sharp enough to cut, fresh enough to burn. But here, there is only the sweet, suffocating embrace of the damp. I stumble, my boot catching on a sleeper, and I fall into the black muck of the floor. The air is even worse down here, thick and stagnant. I scramble upward, clawing at the rough coal, my fingernails breaking against the stone. The tiny blue light on my cap gives one final, desperate leap, a spark of defiance, and then it vanishes. The darkness is now complete. It is a sensory burial. I am standing in the gut of the earth, unable to see my own hand, breathing air that is slowly turning to stone in my chest. I stay perfectly still, listening. In the absence of sight, the mind becomes a symphony of groans. I can hear the settling of the strata miles above, a sound like a giant's teeth grinding in a dream. I am small. I am nothing. I am a pocket of warmth in a universe of cold, wet carbon, and the mountain is exhaling its long, slow breath onto my neck. The darkness is no longer a void. It has become a solid presence, a physical weight that presses against my eyelids until they ache. But even without sight, I can hear the mountain beginning to speak. It is a sound that starts as a low, mournful hum, a vibration that travels through the soles of my boots and settles in the pit of my stomach. Then comes the crack. It is not the sharp, clean snap of a dry twig, but a deep, visceral boom that sounds like a cannon firing in a cathedral of ice. It is the sound of the squeeze, the weight of 3,000 feet of rock deciding that the hollow space I am standing in should no longer exist. To my left, the massive coal pillars, left there by the viewers to hold up the world, begin to fall. I can hear the coal shedding its outer skin, the fragments hitting the floor with a rhythmic patter-patter that sounds like a hard rain on a tin roof. The pressure is so immense that the coal is being turned into dust before it even falls. There is a terrifying energy in the air, a tension so taut that I feel as though a single word from me would cause the entire gallery to collapse into a heap of splintered timber and crushed bone. Then comes the groaning of the props. These were sturdy trunks of larch, thick as a man's waist, but under the squeeze, they are being treated like toothpicks. I hear the wood fibers screaming, a long, drawn-out reek as they are compressed inch by agonizing inch. The bark is popping off in jagged shards, and I can smell the sudden, sharp scent of fresh resin, the dying breath of a tree that was cut down in the sunlight, now being pulverized in the dark. The floor beneath me begins to heave. The rock is so stressed that the very ground is buckling upward to meet the ceiling, a slow-motion jaw closing on everything in its path. I reach out a hand in the pitch black, feeling for the wall, but my fingers meet a timber that is hot to the touch. The friction of the pressure is generating heat. The wood is vibrating so violently that it feels like a living, terrified heart beating beneath my palm. I pull my hand back, a cold sweat breaking out across my chest that has nothing to do with the humidity. This is the mountain's ultimate authority. We are not miners, we are parasites, and the host is tired of the irritation. The sound of the shifting strata is a symphony of destruction. Above me, I hear the thud hiss of shale layers sliding against one another, a grinding of tectonic plates that makes my teeth rattle. It's a rhythmic, mechanical sound, like the gears of a great, rusted clock being forced to turn. Each groan of the roof tells me exactly where the weight is moving. It's moving toward the face. It's moving toward me. I am standing in the center of a settling tomb, and the only exit is a mile of narrowing, shrieking tunnels. I find myself shrinking, pulling my limbs into the smallest possible space, as if by becoming tiny I might escape the mountain's notice. The air is thick with the smell of pulverized stone and the ozone-like tang of crushed minerals. Every few seconds, a bump sends a shockwave through the air that knocks the breath from my lungs. It is a physical blow, a punch from the earth itself. I can hear the distant, frantic braying of a pony, a high, thin sound of pure terror that cuts through the bass-heavy roar of the squeeze. He is trapped in the main gate, feeling the rails beneath him twist and curl like ribbons. I wait. There is nothing else to do. In the darkness, with the world screaming around me, I realize that my life is held in place by nothing more than a few rotting logs and the stubbornness of a seam of carbon. I am a witness to a slow-motion landslide, a catastrophe that takes hours to complete its work. The silence of the men in the nearby stalls is the most frightening thing of all. No one calls out. No one prays aloud. We all simply listen to the wood, waiting for the final, splintering crash that will turn the orange spark of our lives into a permanent, black silence. The floor gives another violent lurch, and a spray of grit hits my face. I can feel the ceiling lowering. The gap that was once 4 feet is now 3, the air being squeezed out like water from a sponge. I am being pressed into the earth, a fossil in the making, while the mountain sings its jagged, rhythmic song of reclamation. The squeeze eventually settles into a low, predatory growl, but it leaves behind a new kind of terror, the dust. It is not the heavy, visible grit that falls when the pick strikes the face. This is the choke dust, a fine, impalpable flower of carbon that hangs suspended in the dead air like a ghost. It is so light that it does not settle. It floats, shimmering invisibly in the weak light of the lamp, waiting to be drawn into the wet warmth of the throat. Every breath I take is a betrayal of my own body. I can feel it coating the back of my tongue, a dry, peppery film that turns my saliva into a thick, bitter paste. The lungs are no longer organs of air, they are becoming filters of stone. With every inhalation, I feel the minute stabs of 1,000 obsidian needles settling into the delicate branches of my chest. It is a slow, rhythmic accumulation, a silent silting up of the spirit. The cough begins deep in the diaphragm, a hollow, racking bark that echoes off the low ceiling and shakes my entire frame. When it comes, it is a violent, desperate attempt by the body to purge the mountain, but the mountain is winning. I spit into the palm of my hand, and even in the gloom, I can see the result, a dark, viscous ink, the very essence of the coal seam returned to the world in a shroud of mucus. This is the black spit, the mark of the trade that stays with us long after the shift is done. It is the sensory memory of the deep, a rhythmic rattling in the chest that becomes the background music of our lives. When I am quiet, I can hear the lungs of the men around me, a chorus of wheezes and whistles that sounds like a forest of dying trees in a high wind. We are all being slowly turned into coal from the inside out. Our blood is thickening with it, our hearts laboring to pump through vessels that are increasingly lined with the soot of 1,000,000-year-old rot. The taste of the dust is a complexity of misery. It is metallic, like sucking on a copper coin, yet it carries the sulphurous tang of the deep earth and the stale, recycled breath of 1,000 predecessors. It dries out the membranes of the nose until they crack and bleed, the blood mixing with the dust to form jagged, painful crusts. I try to drink from my tin bottle, but the water is warm and tastes of the metal casing, and it only serves to turn the dust in my throat into a slick, black mud that is harder to dislodge. There is no washing this away. It is a permanent occupation. As I swing the pick, the movement agitates the air, sending fresh clouds of the choke dust swirling around my head. I see it dancing in the orange halo of my candle, a swirling vortex of black diamonds that I am forced to consume. I find myself breathing shallower and shallower, a subconscious attempt to minimize the intake, but the labor demands oxygen. The more I work, the more I must breathe. The more I breathe, the more I die. It is the cruelest geometry of the pit. The strength required to earn my bread is the very thing that ensures I will not live to eat it in old age. The dust settles in the creases of my eyes, grinding against the lids until every blink feels like a sweep of sandpaper. It finds the raw pit rot on my thighs and turns the chafing into an abrasive agony. But it is the silence of the dust that is most haunting. Unlike the roar of a cave-in or the ring of the iron, the dust makes no sound as it claims you. It is a soft, velvet executioner. I look at the man in the next stall, his form blurred by the haze, and he looks like a statue being slowly carved out of shadows. We are becoming indistinguishable from the walls we mine, our features softening, our voices thickening, our very identities being buried under a layer of unyielding carbon. I lean against a timber, my chest heaving in that jagged, rhythmic struggle for a clean draft that does not exist. The miner's asthma is a heavy hand pressing down on my sternum, a constant reminder that the sky is far away and the air up there is a thin, watery gruel compared to the dense, black soup of the deep. I close my eyes, and the darkness inside is the same as the darkness outside, heavy, soot-stained, and smelling of the end of all things. I raise the pick again, my lungs rattling like a bag of dry bones, and strike the coal. Each blow sends a fresh puff of the black flour into the air, a silent invitation to the mountain to come inside and stay forever. The spasm in my chest finally subsides, leaving behind a hollow, aching scrape that radiates from my breastbone to the back of my throat, but the dust remains, suspended in the stagnant air of the solitary stall. I am working the furthest heading, a blind alley driven deep into a jagged fault line where the coal seam twists and thins into a ragged, unpredictable vein. It is a place the overmen avoid, a place where the air refuses to circulate and the rock feels older, colder, and infinitely more hostile. There are no other men here. The nearest human being is a quarter of a mile away, separated from me by a maze of collapsing pillars, flooded sumps, and the suffocating weight of the unyielding earth. The boys with the corves will not traverse this deep into the labyrinth for hours. I am entirely, fundamentally alone, a single, fragile pulse buried in the vast, indifferent belly of the world. The isolation here is not merely the absence of company, it is a heavy, physical garment that drapes over the shoulders and tightens around the throat. In the busier galleries, there is at least the shared rhythm of misery, the distant thud of another man's pick, the muffled curse echoing down a drift, the tragic, rhythmic squelch of a pony's hooves. Those sounds, however desperate, are anchors. They tether a man to the reality of his own existence, proving that he is part of a collective struggle against the stone. But in the solitary stall, those anchors are severed. The silence is not peaceful, it is a predatory, sepulchral stillness that rushes in to fill the ears the moment the iron stops striking the coal. It is a vacuum that threatens to suck the very identity out of my skull. I lower my pick, resting the heavy iron head in the wet slack between my boots, and I simply breathe. I listen to the terrifying rhythm of my own body. The blood rushing through the veins in my neck sounds like a distant, subterranean river. My heart beats against my ribs with a frantic, muffled thumping, like a trapped bird throwing itself against a window pane. In this total sensory void, the mind becomes hyper-aware of the flesh. I feel the microscopic grinding of cartilage in my knees, the localized burning of the pit rot on my thighs, the dull, throbbing ache of the swollen joints in my fingers. The body is breaking down, and in the quiet of the far heading, I am forced to be the sole audience to its slow destruction. My lamp is failing. The oil is a viscous, muddy dregs at the bottom of the reservoir, and the wick is charred down to a useless nub. The flame does not cast light so much as it casts a sickly, trembling discoloration against the wet shale. It illuminates nothing but the suffocating proximity of the walls. I am wedged into a space barely 3 feet high and 4 feet wide. The roof above me sags, the slate belly of the mountain threatening to touch the crown of my cap. When I shift my weight, my shoulder blades scrape against the jagged rock behind me. I am enclosed in a rough-hewn coffin, perfectly tailored to my dimensions, waiting only for the final, decisive groan of the strata to seal the lid. I watch the flame give a final, desperate leap, a tiny blue spark that detaches from the wick, hovers for a fraction of a second in the dead air, and vanishes. The darkness that follows is not a color. It is a substance. It is a thick, asphyxiating fluid that pours into the stall, filling every crevice, pressing against the eyes with a physical weight. There is no ambient light here, no distant star, no moon bleeding through a crack in the ceiling. It is the absolute, prehistoric blackness of the deep earth, a darkness that has remained undisturbed since the oceans first swallowed the forests millions of years ago. I hold my hand 2 inches from my face and strain my eyes until the optic nerves ache, but there is nothing. I have been erased. My body has dissolved into the surrounding void, leaving only the terrified, shivering point of consciousness hovering in the center of the mountain. The human brain is not designed for the void. Starved of the sunlight it was born under, denied the colors of the grass and the sky, the mind begins to rebel against the sensory starvation. It refuses to accept the total victory of the coal. It begins to manufacture its own light, to project its own reality onto the unyielding canvas of the dark. It starts as a subtle, creeping phenomenon. I close my eyes, and beneath the lids, I see a swirling, formless mist of phosphenes, dull, muddy shapes of bruised purple and sickly green that pulse in time with my heartbeat. They are the desperate misfires of a dying optic nerve, struggling to find a horizon in a place that has none. But the isolation deepens the desperation, and the formless shapes begin to coalesce. The mind reaches back into its deepest, most closely guarded reserves, pulling up the memory of the surface world to defend itself against the crushing reality of the pit. The purple mist brightens, shifting from the color of bruised flesh into a pale, watery yellow. I open my eyes, staring blindly into the pitch-black space where the coal face should be, but the blackness is beginning to tear. A patch of the wall directly in front of me seems to dissolve, replaced by a soft, golden glow. It is not the harsh, flickering orange of a tallow candle, nor the sickly blue of the black damp. It is the pure, blinding, glorious light of the sun. The hallucination is incredibly, agonizingly vivid. It bleeds outward, washing over the jagged edges of the shale, melting the terrifying confines of the solitary stall. The rock recedes, the low ceiling vanishes, and suddenly, I am no longer buried 3,000 feet beneath the mud. I am standing in a field of high summer wheat. The sensory projection is overwhelmingly complete. The damp, mold-scented air of the mine is replaced by a rush of memory so potent it brings a sob to my throat. I can smell the earth, not the dead, silicious rot of the coal seam, but the rich, loamy scent of sun-baked soil and crushed green stalks. I can feel the warmth of the light settling on the back of my neck, a gentle, radiating heat that reaches deep into the frozen, aching marrow of my bones. It is a warmth I have not felt in 6 months, a warmth that belongs to a different man, a man who walked upright in the wind. I see the stalks of wheat swaying in a breeze I cannot feel, their golden heads heavy with grain, brushing against my hands. I look down at my hands in the vision, and they are not the gnarled, black-stained claws of a pitman. They are clean. The skin is unbroken, the fingernails clear of the ubiquitous grease and grit. I can see the blue veins running over the back of my hand, tracing a map of a living, healthy body. I hear the distant, high-pitched laughter of children, my children, perhaps, or perhaps just the ghosts of a childhood I was forced to abandon when I was sent down the shaft at the age of 7. The sound is like crystal shattering in the oppressive silence of my mind. For a long, suspended eternity, I live inside this golden lie. I surrender to it completely, letting the hallucinated sun burn away the damp and the dread. I turn my face upward, closing my eyes against the imagined glare, feeling the phantom breeze stir the hair on my forehead. It is a moment of pure, transcendent ecstasy, a frantic, desperate escape orchestrated by a brain that cannot endure another second of the abyss. I am free. The mountain has not conquered me. The sky is still there, vast and blue and impossibly high, a dome of salvation stretching over a world of endless green. I reach out my hand, extending my fingers to touch the swaying wheat, to confirm the miracle, to hold on to the light so that it can never be extinguished again. My knuckles strike the coal face. The impact is sharp, jarring, and brutally real. The physical shock shatters the fragile architecture of the hallucination instantly. The golden field does not merely fade, it violently implodes, sucking the light, the warmth, and the smell of the earth down into a microscopic point before winking out of existence entirely. The darkness slams back into place with the force of a physical blow. The absolute, suffocating blackness rushes into my eyes, my nose, my mouth. The freezing, wet dampness of the deep instantly reclaims my skin, the phantom warmth of the sun replaced by the biting, mineral-heavy chill of the stagnant air. The smell of the wheat is gone, instantly replaced by the sickening, sweet rot of the fungus on the timber props and the dry, coppery taste of the choke dust. The psychological whiplash is devastating. To be given the sun, to feel its heat and see its color, only to have it ripped away by the unyielding reality of the stone, is a torture far worse than the simple absence of light. I fall to my knees in the black sludge of the sump, the freezing water seeping instantly through the knees of my trousers. The solitary stall has never felt smaller. The ceiling has never felt heavier. The realization that the golden field was nothing but a desperate, pathetic trick of my own unraveling mind drops onto my shoulders like a second mountain. I am still here. I am still buried. The sky is a million miles away, a myth, a rumor, a cruel joke played on men who are destined to die in the dark. The memory of the sun has only served to illuminate the terrifying depth of my own misery. It has sharpened the cold, amplified the silence, and deepened the blackness. I remain on my knees in the muck, my breath coming in ragged, dust-choked gasps that echo loudly in the tight space. I press my forehead against the rough, weeping face of the coal, feeling the jagged edges of the seam cut into the skin above my brow. The rock is cold, indifferent, and infinitely patient. It does not care about my hallucinations. It does not care about my memories of the light. It only knows the pressure, the damp, and the slow, inevitable grinding down of bone and spirit. My hand, shivering uncontrollably from the sudden drop in temperature and the shock of the broken illusion, gropes blindly in the sludge until my fingers brush against the slick, wooden haft of the pickaxe. I close my grip around it. The calluses on my palms scream in protest, the raw nerves firing a jagged warning up my arm, but I hold on tightly. It is the only real thing left in the world. I am a creature of the dark, a mechanism of the mind, and there is no escape into the golden fields of the mind. I must swing the iron in the blackness. I must strike the unseen wall. I must carve another inch into my own tomb, because the silence of the solitary stall is waiting to swallow me whole, and the only way to prove I am still alive is to make the mountain bleed. The iron of the pick is cold, a dead thing in my blistered hands, but I swing it anyway. I swing it blindly into the absolute, suffocating void. The iron bites into the unseen coal with a dull, jarring thud that sends a violent tremor up the bones of my forearms, rattling the teeth in my skull. I strike again and again, driven by the sheer, animalistic terror of the stillness. I must make a noise. I must force the mountain to acknowledge that I am still here, still breathing the foul, stagnant air of the solitary stall. But my muscles, starved of oxygen and pushed far beyond the limits of human endurance, finally rebel. The pick slips from my slackening grip, its handle slick with my own blood and the greasy coal tar, and it falls into the invisible, freezing sludge at my feet with a wet splash. My body collapses inward. I slump back against the weeping shale of the tunnel wall, the rough, jagged edges of the stone tearing at the soaked wool of my shirt. The hallucination of the sun has drained the last reserves of my spirit, leaving behind a hollow, gnawing ache in the pit of my stomach that cannot be ignored. It is the deep, acidic cramping of a body that is beginning to consume itself for fuel. It is time for snap, the brief, pathetic respite where we attempt to feed the flesh so that it might continue to break the rock. In the pitch black, I must rely entirely on the memory of my hands. I crawl backward through the narrow, 3-foot-high drift, my knees dragging through the sump water, my shoulders scraping the low roof. I feel along the ribbed, wet timber of a support prop until my numb fingers brush against the heavy, sodden mass of my jacket, hung on a rusted nail hours or perhaps days ago. The wool is freezing, saturated with the pervasive, mold-scented dampness of the pit. I plunge my hand into the pocket and pull out the snap tin. It is a small, oval container of battered tin, dented by a dozen minor roof falls and scratched by the abrasive dust. In the world above, this tin was packed by my wife in the pre-dawn candlelight. I try to conjure the image of her hands, clean and warm, wrapping the bread in a piece of linen, but the image is faint, obscured by the crushing weight of the dark. I pry the lid open. The metallic scrape echoes sharply in the small space, a foreign, manufactured sound in a cathedral of ancient stone. I reach inside, but the tragedy of the deep is that nothing remains pure here. My hands are coated in a thick, impermeable layer of the mine. The skin is a map of soot, dried blood from a dozen small cuts, and the silicious, caustic mud of the floor. There is no water to wash with, no rag clean enough to wipe them. To eat in the pit is to eat the pit itself. My blackened, gnarled fingers close around the thick slice of bread and the small wedge of hard cheese. I bring the food to my face, and before it even touches my lips, I can smell the contamination. The bread does not smell of yeast or hearth smoke. It smells of sulfur, of the sweet, sickening rot of the fungal timber, and of the heavy, coppery taint of my own unwashed sweat. I take a bite. The texture is a profound violation of the senses. The bread has absorbed the humid, foul air, becoming a dense, spongy mass that clings to the roof of the mouth, but it is the grit that dominates the experience. The fine, invisible choke dust that hangs in the air has settled onto the food, and my own hands have smeared the crust with heavier flakes of coal. As I chew, the silicious sand grinds horribly against the enamel on my teeth. It is a sound that vibrates through the jawbone, a sickening crunch that makes my stomach heave. I am swallowing the very mountain that is trying to crush me. The cold dust mixes with my scarce saliva, forming a gritty, bitter paste that tastes of ash and prehistoric death. It scrapes down the back of my throat, aggravating the raw, inflamed tissue left behind by the miner's cough. I reach for my water canteen, a heavy leather jack slung over the timber. I pull the wooden stopper and drink, but the water offers no salvation. It has been sitting in the stagnant heat of the heading, absorbing the foulness of the atmosphere. It is tepid, tasting heavily of the leather, of rust, and of the metallic bite of iron parites. It does not quench the thirst, it merely washes the black mud further down into my gut, leaving a heavy, nauseating weight in my belly. As I sit there in the total dark, chewing the gritty paste, the silence is broken by a new, insidious sound. It is a soft, frantic scratching, accompanied by a high, rhythmic chittering. The rats. They are the true masters of the labyrinth, the only creatures that thrive in this suffocating void. They are not like the timid rodents of the surface barns. The pit rats are bold, muscular, and driven by a ravenous, unending hunger. They navigate the pitch-black tunnels with terrifying precision, drawn by the smell of the sweat, the leather, and the meager crumbs of my snap. I hear the wet, pattering sound of their claws on the shale, moving closer. They do not fear me. In the dark, a man is just another slowly dying obstacle, a potential source of food. I feel a sudden, horrifying weight on the toe of my boot, followed by the brush of coarse, wet fur against my ankle. I kick out violently, my heavy, iron-shod boot striking the unseen rock with a spark of static fire, and the chittering scatters back into the void, only to resume a few feet away. They are circling, waiting just beyond the reach of my limbs. They know that eventually, the shift will end, or the roof will fall, or my heart will simply stop beating, and then the dark will belong entirely to them. I clutch the remaining crust of my bread tightly to my chest, fiercely guarding this contaminated morsel from the vermin that share my grave. When the last of the bitter, grit-laced bread is swallowed, the sudden influx of heavy, indigestible food diverts the blood from my exhausted limbs to my stomach. An overwhelming, crushing wave of fatigue crashes over me. It is not the gentle tiredness of a day's honest labor in the sun, it is a physical collapse, a total system failure brought on by sensory starvation, oxygen deprivation, and the relentless, agonizing strain of the crouch. I must sleep. I must find a few moments of oblivion before I am forced to pick up the iron again. But there are no beds in the deep. There is only the the packed walls of loose, shattered waste rock that we build behind us as we advance the face. I drag myself backward into a narrow, secondary crosscut, seeking a space away from the main ventilation draft, which, though foul, carries a biting, evaporative chill that can freeze the sweat on a man's back. I find a crevice, a jagged indentation in the waste wall barely large enough for a dog. To fit inside, I must fold my body into a tight, agonizing knot. I draw my knees up tightly against my chest, wrapping my heavily calloused, bleeding hands around my shins. I tuck my chin down into the collar of my wet jacket, trying to conserve whatever pathetic scrap of body heat I have left. The rock beneath me is uneven, sharp shards of slate pressing directly into the muscles of my hips and shoulders. This is the reality of the narrow tunnels for sleep. It is a posture of absolute vulnerability and intense physical pain. Within minutes, the cold of the earth begins to invade my flesh. The dampness of my trousers, soaked through from kneeling in the sump, clings to my legs like a sheath of ice. The pit rot on my inner thighs flares into a burning, itching torment, but the space is too confined to even reach down and scratch. Above me, the roof continues its slow, terrifying weep. Drip. Splash. A drop of freezing, mineral-heavy groundwater falls directly onto the back of my neck, sliding down my spine like an icy finger. I shiver violently, my teeth chattering in the pitch blackness, the sound echoing loudly in my own skull. Sleep in the pit is not a sanctuary, it is a nightmare painted in shades of invisible terror. As consciousness begins to slip away, the mind remains chained to the surrounding danger. The hearing, unhindered by sight, becomes agonizingly acute. I hover on the precipice of slumber, but every groan of the timber props, every distant, muffled thud of shifting strata, jolts me back to a state of panic. I am sleeping in the belly of a beast that is constantly chewing. The fear of the squeeze never leaves. To fall asleep completely is to risk never waking up, to risk being crushed flat into the shale without ever seeing the blow coming. When exhaustion finally drags me under, the dreams are not of the golden wheat fields or the open sky. The mind, poisoned by the black damp and traumatized by the dark, conjures only visions of suffocation. I dream of the walls closing in, the rough stone pressing against my ribs until they crack. I dream of drowning in a thick, black sea of choke dust, unable to draw a single breath while the pit rats swarm over my face. I wake with a violent, gasping start, my body thrashing out instinctively against the imagined confines of the dream. My head slams hard against the low, jagged roof of the crosscut. The sharp impact sends a blinding flash of pain behind my eyes, and a warm trickle of blood mixes with the soot on my forehead. I sit frozen, my heart hammering a frantic, terrifying rhythm against my sternum, gasping for the thin, foul air. The absolute darkness greets my open eyes, indifferent and unchanging. There is no way to know how long I slept. It could have been 5 minutes, it could have been an hour. Time has rotted away down here, leaving only the endless, cyclic torment of the present moment. My limbs are stiff, locked into painful, cramped angles by the cold and the awkward posture. It takes a monumental effort just to unbend my knees, the joints popping and grinding loudly in the silence. The brief rest has not restored me. It has only allowed the cold to settle deeper into the marrow and the stiffness to bind the muscles. The ache in my stomach has been replaced by a heavy, nauseating stone of undigested, coalesced bread. The rats are still out there, waiting in the void. The roof is still heavy. The isolation of the solitary stall is absolute. I reach out a trembling, numb hand into the pitch-black sludge, my fingers groping blindly through the freezing muck until they finally close around the cold, wood handle of the pickaxe. The cycle must begin again. The mountain demands its toll. My hand finds the pickaxe in the sludge, but as I wrap my fingers around the haft, a new terror seizes me. I bring my other hand up to my face, expecting to see the faint, gray outline of my own palm in the ambient gloom of the stall. There is nothing. I blink hard, squeezing my eyelids shut until stars explode behind them, then open them wide again. Still nothing. The darkness is absolute, a heavy, velvet curtain that has been drawn permanently across the world. Panic, cold and sharp as a splinter of ice, drives a spike into my chest. Is the lamp truly dead? Or have my eyes finally succumbed to the pit blindness? The nystagmus, the dreaded dancing eyes, has been teasing me for weeks. It starts as a rapid, uncontrollable oscillation of the eyeballs, a desperate attempt by the optic nerves to find a focal point in the featureless dark. Now, staring into the void, I feel my eyes vibrating in their sockets, a dizzying, sickening sensation that makes the floor seem to tilt and pitch like the deck of a ship in a storm. I cannot tell if I am looking up or down, left or right. The equilibrium of the inner ear, confused by the lack of a horizon, begins to fail. I am floating in a sea of black ink, untethered from gravity, my only anchor the cold, wood handle of the tool in my hand. I must work by touch. This is the final degradation, the ultimate surrender of the human form to the mountain. I am no longer a man with vision. I am a mole, a creature of tactile sensation and instinct. I crawl forward on my hands and knees, the sharp shale biting into my skin, until my helmet bumps against the coal face. It is cold, slick with moisture, and unnervingly smooth in places, jagged in others. I run my fingers over the seam, tracing the veins and fissures like a blind man reading a perverse braille. Here, a band of brass, hard iron parietes that will strike sparks. There, a soft pocket of Dante coal that will crumble easily. I position myself on my side, jamming my shoulder into a hollow in the floor to brace against the recoil. I raise the pick, gauging the distance to the roof by the brush of the wood against my ear. Swing! The iron strikes the rock, sending a shockwave up my arm that rattles my teeth. Clack! I missed the sweet spot. I struck high, hitting the harder stone of the roof. A shower of grit rains down on my face, stinging my cheeks and getting into my open, staring eyes. I do not blink. There is no point. The dust mixes with the tears of irritation, forming a gritty paste that glues my eyelashes together. Working in the dark changes the nature of the labor. It becomes a rhythm of pure muscle memory and auditory feedback. I listen to the sound of the pick entering the coal. A dull thud means I've hit good fuel. A high-pitched ping means stone. A hollow crumble means I've dislodged a block. I become a connoisseur of impact, translating vibration into geology. But the cost is high. Without sight to guide the blow, my accuracy suffers. I strike my own boot, the steel tip saving my toes but sending a jolt of pain up my shin. I graze my knuckles against the rough wall, tearing the skin, and the salt and the sweat stings the fresh wounds like fire. The psychological decay is slower, more insidious. In the absence of light, the mind loses its ability to measure progress. Have I been working for 10 minutes or 10 hours? Have I cleared a ton of coal or just a wheelbarrow's worth? The uncertainty breeds a paranoia that gnaws at the edges of my sanity. I begin to doubt my own existence. Am I still moving? Or am I just dreaming of movement while my body lies comatose in the gob? I start to talk to myself, a low, guttural muttering that echoes flatly in the confined space. Strike. Pull. Breathe. Strike. Pull. Breathe. The words are not for communication, they are for confirmation. They are proof that I am distinct from the silence. The darkness also seems to amplify the presence of the mind. I feel watched. Not by the rats or the overman, but by the coal itself. It feels heavy, sentient, and malevolent. I imagine faces in the rock, ancient, distorted visages that leer at me from the blackness. I hear whispers in the hiss of the escaping gas, voices of men long dead, murmuring secrets about the faults and the fire damp. Don't hit there, they seem to say. Not that rock. Not that one. I shake my head violently, trying to dislodge the voices, but they only grow louder, mixing with the ringing in my ears and the rhythmic thud-thud-thud of my own heart. I reach out to clear the loose coal I've cut, my hands acting as shovels. I scoop the sharp, jagged fragments into a pile near my feet. My fingers are numb, the nerve endings deadened by the cold and the constant abrasion, so I don't feel the cuts until the warm blood makes the coal slippery. I am dismantling the mountain by hand, piece by piece, in the dark. It feels like trying to empty the ocean with a spoon. The sheer scale of the task, set against my own frailty, is crushing. I am a finite creature fighting in infinite geology. Suddenly, my hand brushes against something that is not coal and not stone. It is soft, yielding, and furred. A rat. It squeals a high, piercing sound that cuts through the stagnant air and sinks its teeth into the meat of my thumb. The pain is electric, a jolt of pure, white-hot agony that travels straight to my shoulder. I recoil, shouting into the dark, scrambling backward on my elbows. I hear the rat scurry away, its claws scrabbling on the loose shale. I clutch my throbbing hand to my chest, rocking back and forth in the sludge. The bite throbs in time with my pulse, a new, sharp rhythm added to the symphony of pain. I sit there in the absolute blackness, sucking the blood from my thumb, tasting the iron and the coal dust. The isolation is complete. I am blind, bleeding, and buried. The world above, the world of light, of color, of safety, feels like a fantasy from a book I read a lifetime ago. Here, there is only the tactile reality of the suffering. The rough floor. The wet walls. The throbbing hand. The heavy air. And the pickaxe, waiting in the dark like a demanding master. I reach out again. I must. The tub is not full. The shift is not over. My hand finds the haft, slippery now with my own blood. I grip it tighter than before, fueled by a sudden, irrational rage at the rat, at the dark, at the mountain. I will not die here. I will not let the silence win. I raise the pick, screaming a silent, primal roar in my throat, and bring it down into the blackness with every ounce of strength I have left. Crack. The coal splinters. I strike again. Crack. I am fighting the dark with iron, and for a brief, fleeting moment, the violence of the work is the only thing that makes me feel alive. The violence of my own strike echoes down the blind heading, a jagged sound that seems to tear at the very fabric of the dark, but as the reverberation fades into the weeping walls, a new and entirely different terror begins to manifest. It does not arrive with the concussive boom of a settling roof, nor does it announce itself with the wet, desperate coughing of a man drowning in choke dust. It arrives as a shift in the absolute stillness. I am panting, my lungs heaving in the aftermath of my desperate assault on the coal face, pulling the stagnant atmosphere deep into my chest. And as I drag the air over my cracked lips, I feel it. The texture of the void has changed. The heavy, suffocating blanket of the black damp, that dead, invisible sea that extinguishes flames and sends men to sleep in the mud, has inexplicably lifted. In its place is something infinitely more malicious, creeping along the roof of the gallery in total, breathless silence. It is the fire damp. The old miners call it the breath of the beast, the ghost of the ancient forests, exhaled from the crushed and rotting veins of the earth after being trapped under millions of tons of pressure since the dawn of the world. It bleeds from the microscopic fissures in the coal, an invisible, odorless tide that carries no weight. It does not sink into the sump where the rats scurry. It rises. It pulls against the low, jagged ceiling of shale directly above my hunched back, building layer upon layer, displacing the breathable air with a silent, concentrated malice. I feel its presence before I have any visual proof. There is a strange, phantom lightness in my head, a dizzying, narcotic buoyancy that stands in horrific contrast to the agonizing fatigue in my limbs. The fire damp does not choke you like the dust, it intoxicates. My heart, which had been hammering a heavy, exhausted rhythm against my ribs, begins to race with a terrifying, hollow speed. A false energy surges through my veins, a panicked, chemical adrenaline drawn from the tainted atmosphere. The air entering my nose feels thinner, sharper, carrying a faint, almost metallic sweetness that coats the back of the palate like the taste of a copper coin held under the tongue. It is a flavor that every pitman learns to recognize, a flavor that stops the blood cold in the veins. I must see it. I must know how deep the invisible river above me has become. With trembling, blood-slick fingers, I reach into the deep, sodden pocket of my woolen jacket and retrieve my emergency tin. Inside is a single, unbroken tallow taper and a piece of rough flint. The very act of holding the flint makes my stomach heave with a paralyzing dread. To strike a spark in a heading heavy with fire damp is to play a game of dice with the devil, using your own life as the wager. But the ignorance is worse. The absolute, blinding darkness amplifies the paranoia until I feel as though the gas is wrapping its invisible fingers around my throat. I must see the cap. I bring the flint and steel close to my chest, shielding it with my body, burying my face into my own damp shoulder to muffle the sound and contain the flash. I strike. The sharp snick of the metal is deafening in the solitary stall. A tiny, brilliant speck of orange fire is born in the void, falling onto the charred wick of the taper. I blow on it gently, a long, trembling exhalation, until the tallow catches. A weak, yellow flame sputters to life, pushing the absolute blackness back just a few inches from my face. I do not look at my bleeding hand. I do not look at the cold face, nor the weeping fungus on the rotting timber props. I slowly, agonizingly, raise the taper toward the low ceiling. The flame knows the gas is there long before a man does. As I lift the candle, the behavior of the fire begins to change, governed by the terrifying physics of the deep earth. The steady, teardrop shape of the yellow light begins to elongate. It stretches upward, pulling away from the wick as if drawn by some invisible, magnetic force in the roof. The color shifts, bleeding away from a warm, comforting orange into a pale, sickly, translucent blue. There it is. The corpse candle. The blue cap. It hovers just above the yellow flame, a ghostly, dancing halo of azure light that trembles in the still air. I freeze, my breath caught rigidly in my throat, the muscles in my raised arm locking into stone. I watch the blue cap, measuring its height with a morbid, terrified calculation. Half an inch of blue means the heading is fouling, a warning to finish the shift and retreat. An inch of blue means the gas is thick, hovering at the threshold of disaster. The cap on my taper is nearly 2 inches tall. It is a spire of cold, blue fire, reaching greedily for the heavy, invisible cloud of methane that is pressing down against my helmet. The air in the stall is no longer just a mixture of dust and damp, it has become a fully primed explosive. The gallery is a loaded cannon barrel, 3,000 feet beneath the mud, and I am standing inside the powder charge with a burning match in my hand. I slowly, smoothly lower the taper to the floor, terrified that a sudden movement, a mere waft of my hand, might agitate the stratified layers of the air and pull the concentrated gas down into the open flame. The blue cap shrinks as the candle descends into the heavier, breathable air near the sludge, settling back into a normal, trembling yellow light. I place the candle on a piece of slate in the sump, submerging the base in the freezing water so it will not topple. The light it casts is pathetic, illuminating nothing but the toes of my boots and the swirling, oily film on the puddles, but it is enough to anchor my mind. The psychological weight of the fire damp is fundamentally different from the terror of the crush or the slow death of the dust. The roof groans before it falls. It warns you with a symphony of splintering timber and raining shale. The choke dust is a visible enemy, a black fog that you can taste and spit onto the floor. But the fire damp is a silent assassin. It offers no warning. It has no mass, casts no shadow, makes no sound. It is a state of absolute, unbearable potential energy. It transforms the very atmosphere we rely on into a weapon of mass annihilation. Every action I take is now framed by the possibility of instantaneous immolation. The pickaxe lying in the muck at my feet, the tool of my survival, has suddenly become an instrument of suicide. I stare at its heavy iron head, glistening wetly in the faint candlelight. The coal seam before me is riddled with brass nodules of iron parietes hidden within the black carbon. If I swing the pick and the iron strikes the brass, it will throw a spark. In normal air, it is a brief, harmless flash of light. In this air, that single, microscopic diamond of heat will be enough to ignite the blue cap. The ensuing explosion is something we have all felt, even if we survived it. It is not a mere fire. It is a catastrophic, roaring expansion of energy that turns the entire tunnel into a blast furnace. The flame travels faster than a man can scream, a rolling shockwave of blue and white heat that scorches the lungs from the inside out, vaporizing the moisture in the body and turning the skin to charcoal. But the fire is only the first phase. The blast wave turns the coal dust suspended in the air into secondary fuel, propagating the explosion for miles down the main gates, tearing the heavy wooden ventilation doors off their iron hinges, and turning the wooden cords and the pit ponies into flying, pulverized shrapnel. And when the fire has consumed all the oxygen, it leaves behind the afterdamp a suffocating cloud of carbon monoxide that quietly asphyxiates anyone who miraculously survived the burn. I know all this. Every man down here knows it. It is etched into our minds by the widows weeping at the pit head and the blackened, unrecognizable lumps of meat they drag up in the cages after a blow. And yet, the mountain demands its tonnage. The tubs must be filled. I am paralyzed, crouching in the wet slack, looking at the iron pick. If I do not work, I do not eat. If I do not work, my children starve in the freezing, soot-stained cottage above. If I run, I am labeled a coward and turned away from the colliery. I am trapped between the certainty of starvation and the invisible, hovering threat of the fire. The silence of the heading is no longer empty, it is pregnant. It hums with a terrifying, static tension. I can hear the blood rushing in my ears, a fast, high-pitched rushing sound that seems to match the nervous vibration of the blue cap. I wipe the cold sweat from my forehead, smearing the blood from my earlier wound across my eyes. My hands are shaking so violently that I have to clench them into fists and press them hard against my knees to make them stop. I must work. I have no choice. The realization is a cold, heavy stone settling into the pit of my empty stomach. I reach down and wrap my blistered, trembling fingers around the haft of the pickaxe. It feels different now. It feels like a live, venomous serpent in my grip. I pull it from the muck, the wet sound of the suction seeming abnormally loud in the tense atmosphere. I crawl forward, bringing my face inches from the coal seam. I cannot swing the pick from the shoulder. The arc is too wide, The force too great, the risk of a spark too high. I must alter the rhythm of my entire life. I press the cold iron tip directly against the black face of the seam. I grip the handle halfway down the shaft, sacrificing all leverage and power for agonizing control. Instead of striking, I push. I grind the iron into the rock, twisting my wrists, using my own body weight to pry small, pathetic flakes of coal from the wall. Scrape. Creak. Crack. The sound is awful. It is a slow, agonizing gnawing, the sound of a desperate animal trying to chew its way through solid stone. The effort required is monumental. Without the momentum of the swing, my forearms burn with a searing, lactic fire within minutes. My shoulders ache, the muscles knotting in protest. Every time the iron slips, every time it grinds sharply against a harder piece of slate, my heart leaps into my throat, expecting the blinding flash of ignition. I am sweating profusely, but the sweat is freezing cold. The fire damp hovering just inches above my head seems to radiate a strange, unnatural chill, contrasting with the suffocating humidity of the lower air. I watch the scene with a terrifying intensity, my eyes wide and unblinking, looking for the dull, metallic gleam of the Parites. I am mining by increments, dissecting the coal with the care of a surgeon trying to remove a tumor from a beating heart. The pace is maddeningly slow. The tub, sitting invisible in the darkness down the drift, will never be filled at this rate. But I cannot speed up. The rhythm of the deep has been broken, replaced by the suffocating, terrified arithmetic of survival. One wrong push. One hidden nodule of brass. One invisible spark. That is all it takes to end the world. I pause, my muscles trembling, and look back at the candle sitting in the sludge. The yellow flame dances weakly, completely unaware of the apocalypse hanging in the air just 2 feet above it. The blue cap is invisible from this angle, hidden in the shadows, but I know it is there. I can feel it. It is waiting. The fire damp is the ultimate expression of the mountain's hatred for us. It does not crush us, it does not bury us, and it does not drown us. It simply alters the invisible rules of our existence, turning our own tools, our own light, and our own desperate need to breathe into the very mechanisms of our destruction. I turn my face back to the black wall, gripping the iron until my knuckles pop, and begin to scrape again, praying to a god I can no longer see that the stone will yield before the spark flies. The scraping of the iron against the coal face is a slow, rhythmic torture, a sound that grates against the raw nerves of my teeth, but it is the silence of my own body that is truly deafening. I am forced now to lie fully on my side, my left hip ground into the freezing, abrasive slush of the floor, my right shoulder jammed against the rough timber of a prop. The adrenaline of the fire-damp discovery is curdled into a cold, trembling exhaustion, and without the narcotic rush of fear to distract me, the physical reality of the undercut begins to scream. This is the posture of the penitent, the worm, the buried thing. To get at the coal in this thinning seam without swinging the pick, I must become a creature of angles and leverage. I am folded in on myself, a hinge of bone and gristle forced shut by the weight of the mountain. My knees are drawn up toward my chest, pressing hard against the wet wool of my trousers. And it is there, in the knees, that the mind exacts its most specific and cruel toll. They call it beat knee. It is a swelling, a dark, fluid-filled balloon that forms over the patella, born from years of kneeling in the slack and the water. It throbs with a dull, sickening heat that radiates through the damp cloth, a constant, low-frequency pulse of agony that syncs with the beating of my heart. Every time I shift my weight to get better purchase on the pick handle, the fluid in the swollen sac shifts, pressing against the taut, inflamed skin. It feels as though I am kneeling on a bag of hot needles. There is no relief. If I straighten my legs, I kick the timber props behind me and risk a roof fall. If I roll to my other side, I expose the other, equally ruin me to the muck. The water in the sump is not a passive element, it is an intruder. Lying here, cheek pressed against the wet shale, I feel the cold, black fluid seeping into my ear. It is a terrifying sensation, the feeling of the deep earth physically entering the skull, filling the auditory canal with the silence of the grave. I shake my head violently, spraying the gritty water into the dark, but it returns with the next movement, a relentless, icy tide. The skin on the side of my face is numb, anesthetized by the cold, yet beneath the numbness, I can feel the sharp grit of the coal dust grinding into the pores, turning the flesh into a raw, weeping abrasion. My elbow, the fulcrum of my labor, screams in protest. It is locked in a semi-permanent bend, the tendons inflamed and grinding audibly with every minute adjustment of the pick. I am no longer a man of flesh and blood. I am a rusted machine, my joints seized by the damp and the dust. I try to imagine what I must look like to the rats watching from the shadows, a twisted, blackened shape, half submerged in sludge, clawing at the wall like a desperate animal trapped in a drain. The shame of it is a heavy, silent weight. A man is meant to stand. He is meant to walk with his spine vertical, his head held high to the sun. But the pit does not allow verticality. It demands the stoop. Even when I am on the surface, walking the mile to my cottage in the gray twilight of a Sunday, I cannot fully straighten. The pit curve is set into the vertebrae. My shoulders are permanently rounded, rolled forward to protect the chest from the crushing weight of the roof. My neck is craning forward, the muscles thicken and shorten from years of holding up the heavy leather cap in the low galleries. I am being physically sculpted by the mine, molded into a shape that fits only this hole. I pause to wipe the sweat from my eyes, but my hand is a claw, the fingers curled inward and stiff. I have to use the back of my wrist, smearing the grime across my forehead. The friction of the wool against the pit rod on my hip is agonizing, a sharp, burning reminder that my skin is dissolving. The rash is spread, aggravated by the constant damp and the abrasive grit in the water. It feels as though I have been flayed, the raw meat exposed to the toxic chemistry of the deep. The silence of the stall, usually a void, now seems to amplify the internal sounds of my own disintegration. I hear the creak of my shoulder joint, the pop of my hip, the wet squelch of the beat knee shifting in the mud. I am a symphony of ruin. I think of the young boys, the trappers and hurriers, their limbs still straight and green as saplings. They do not know yet that the mine will bend them. They do not know that the rock will drink the fluid from their joints and replace it with dust. They will grow into the shape, just as I have, until they are indistinguishable from the timber props, gnarled, bowed, and ready to snap. I grip the pick tighter, the pain in my hands acting as a jagged focal point. I must focus on the pain. The pain is real. The pain means the nerves are still firing, that the body has not yet surrendered completely to the stone. I drive the iron tip into the base of the seam, leveraging it downward. A block of coal comes loose, falling with a muffled thud into the slush near my belly. It is a small victory, a few pounds of fuel won at the cost of 1,000 stabs of agony. I try to shift my position, to relieve the pressure on my hip, but the cramp seizes my calf, a sudden, violent knotting of the muscle that feels like a hook being pulled through the flesh. I bite down on my lip to keep from screaming, tasting the iron of my own blood. I cannot stretch it out. There is no room. I must simply wait, trembling in the dark, while the muscle spasms and tears, a prisoner in my own skin. The mountain presses down. It presses on the roof, on the air, and on the very structure of my skeleton. I am becoming less human with every shift, evolving backward into something that crawls, something that bleeds, something that belongs in the dark. I look at the pile of coal I have scraped from the wall, black, glistening, sharp. It is the only thing of value here. My body is merely the tool, disposable and degrading, being ground down to dust to feed the furnace of a world I can no longer see. The cramp in my calf finally surrenders, unspooling into a dull, throbbing ache that leaves the muscle feeling as though it has been beaten with a wooden mallet, but the relief is immediately eclipsed by a far more profound disturbance. It does not begin with a sound, but with a sudden, violent change in the pressure of the dead air. My eardrums pop, a sharp, painful concavity that makes me gasp, and a fraction of a second later, the deep, subsonic shudder passes through the shale floor. It is not the localized, splintering crack of a settling roof, nor the grinding heave of the pillars. It is a massive, hollow thump that travels through the bedrock itself, a vibration that rattles the fluid in my ruined knee and shakes the soot from the low ceiling. Every man who has spent more than a week in the deep knows that feeling. It is the heartbeat of catastrophe. Miles away, in some distant, unseen labyrinth of the colliery, perhaps the eastern dip, or the long wall headings, the fire damp has found a spark. The great, invisible beast has detonated. I freeze, my body pressed into the freezing muck, the pickaxe forgotten in my bleeding hands. The silence that follows the vibration is absolute, a vacuum created by terror. I wait for the blast wave, for the roaring wall of blue fire and pulverized coal, but it does not come. I am too deep, too far removed in this solitary, twisting stall, insulated by miles of solid rock and collapsing gob. The fire will not reach me. But the fire is only the executioner's axe. It is the blood it leaves behind that poisons the rest of the kingdom. A few minutes pass in the suffocating stillness. Then, the meager, stagnant draft that passes for ventilation in this heading suddenly dies. The faint, cold breath that usually creeps along the floor, smelling of horse sweat and wet timber, simply stops. The air becomes completely, terrifyingly static. And then, a moment later, it reverses. The pressure of the distant explosion has blown the heavy, iron-hinged ventilation doors off their frames, destroying the carefully engineered circuit of the mine's breath. The air is now being pushed backward, driven by the expanding heat of the distant inferno. With the reversed draft comes the smell. It arrives as a faint, ghost-like wisp at the back of the throat, an odor that makes the stomach instantly heave. It is the unmistakable, sickeningly sweet stench of the blowout. I taste scorched earth, the sharp, acrid tang of pulverized stone heated to 1,000 degrees. But beneath the mineral heat is the organic horror, the smell of roasted larch wood, of smoldering hempen rope, and the foul, unmistakable reek of burnt hair and charred flesh. It is the smell of men and ponies reduced to ash in the span of a single heartbeat. I close my eyes, burying my face into the wet, filthy wool of my sleeve, but the smell penetrates the fabric. It coats my tongue. I am breathing in the funeral pyre of my brothers. I know that somewhere in the dark, men I shared a cage with this morning, men who complained of the cold, who chewed their gritty bread, who owed me a farthing for ale, are now nothing but blackened cinders fused to the shale. The psychological weight of the scent is crushing. It brings with it a wave of profound, paralyzing despair, a heavy, weeping sorrow that mixes with the cold dust in my tear ducts. But there is no time for mourning, because the smell is only the herald. What rides behind the smoke is the true killer of the deep. The afterdamp. When the fire damp burns, it aggressively strips every molecule of life-giving oxygen from the air, replacing it with carbon monoxide, the white damp. It is a gas that possesses no color, casts no shadow, and carries no scent of its own, hiding beneath the lingering reek of the explosion. It does not announce its presence by choking the throat like the silicious dust, nor does it sting the eyes like the sulphurous fumes of the blast. It is a velvet guillotine. It is a poison so insidious, so perfectly designed to unmake the human body, that it seduces the blood before the brain even registers the threat. The onset of the afterdamp is a physical betrayal. My blood, starved of oxygen in this stagnant hole, encounters the carbon monoxide and embraces it with a deadly, chemical eagerness. The gas binds to the red cells, locking them shut, refusing to let them carry life to my struggling organs. The first symptom is a tightness around the skull. It feels as though a band of freezing iron is being slowly tightened around my forehead, pressing mercilessly into the temples. A dull, rhythmic pounding begins at the base of my skull, matching the frantic, terrified racing of my heart. I look at my emergency tallow candle, still sitting in the freezing sump water where I placed it to monitor the fire damp. The flame is changing again, but not into the terrifying blue spire of the explosive gas. Instead, it is dying a slow, miserable death. The yellow teardrop shrinks, growing wide and lethargic. The color shifts to a deep, angry crimson, the edges smoking heavily, throwing off thick, oily strands of soot. The flame is suffocating, drowning in the poisoned air just as surely as I am. It casts a weak, blood-red glow over the jagged coal face, turning the seeping groundwater into rivulets of dark, running gore. Suddenly, a movement catches my eye in the bloody twilight. From out of the packed waste rock of the gob, a pit rat emerges. It is not moving with its usual darting, arrogant speed. It stumbles. It drags its hind legs through the black sludge as if its spine has been severed. It ignores me completely, staggering blindly toward the dim red light of the candle. It stops a foot away, its sides heaving in massive, desperate gasps that produce no sound. Its tiny, black eyes are wide and sightless. It opens its jaws wide, a silent scream into the void, and then simply collapses onto its side. A brief, violent tremor runs through its body, its claws scraping uselessly against the stone, and then it is perfectly still. The king of the dark has been dethroned by the invisible tide. The sight of the dead rat shatters my paralysis, triggering a primal, screaming instinct to flee. I must reach the main intake, the downcast shaft miles away, where the fresh air from the surface might still be fighting its way into the labyrinth. I try to push myself up from the floor, to rise from my agonizing crouch, but my body refuses the command. The afterdamp has flooded my muscles with a profound, terrifying weakness. My legs, already ruined by the beat knee and the cramping, feel as though they are packed with wet sand. My arms, the heavy, callous tools that have broken hundreds of tons of rock, tremble violently and give way when I try to put weight on them. I fall back into the freezing sump, my face splashing into the foul water. Nausea washes over me in a massive, dizzying wave. The cavern seems to spin, the red light of the candle smearing into a long, bloody streak across my vision. I dry heave, my stomach muscles contracting violently, but there is nothing left to expel save the bitter, gritty taste of the coal-laced bread I ate hours ago. The effort leaves me gasping, drawing massive lungfuls of the poisoned air deep into my chest, accelerating my own demise. And then, the most terrifying phase of the afterdamp begins, the seduction. As the brain is starved of oxygen, the panic and the pain begin to miraculously recede. The agonizing burn of the pit rot on my thighs, the throbbing torment of my knee, the freezing bite of the wet wool, they all begin to fade, wrapped in a heavy, narcotic numbness. The terror of the dark, the desperate longing for the sun, the memory of my wife and children, all of it begins to slip away, replaced by an overwhelming, hypnotic desire to simply close my eyes. The stone floor no longer feels jagged and abrasive, it feels soft, welcoming, like a bed of dark velvet. The dripping of the groundwater sounds like a gentle, rhythmic lullaby. The afterdamp whispers to me, promising an end to the labor, an end to the crushing weight of the mountain, an end to the ringing in my ears. It is the sweet death, the final, merciful light told by a merciless earth. Just rest, the dark seems to say. Just lay your head down in the slack. The tubs are full. The shift is over. My eyelids droop, heavier than lead. The blood-red flame of the candle is shrinking to a pinprick, the shadows rushing in to reclaim their territory. In the fading light, the hallucinations begin again, but they are not the bright, sunlit fields of my previous isolation. The smoke and the poison conjure the ghosts of the blowout. I see faces forming in the swirling dust, John with his soot-stained grin, the young trapper boy with his frightened eyes, their features distorted by the red light, their mouths open in silent, burning agony. They are reaching out for me from the gob, inviting me to join them in the permanent silence of the afterdamp. No! The word is a wet, guttural rasp, barely audible over the roaring of the blood in my ears. I bite down on my own lip, biting so hard that my teeth puncture the flesh. The sudden, sharp flare of pain is a jagged lifeline thrown into the drowning pool of my mind. The taste of fresh, metallic blood cuts through the sickly sweetness of the burnt air. I force my eyes open, staring with terrifying intensity at the dying red ember of the candle. I cannot stand. I cannot walk. I can only crawl. I drag myself forward on my belly, abandoning the pickaxe, abandoning the heavy tin canteen. I am nothing but a wretched, dying animal fleeing a burning forest. My elbows dig into the sharp shale, the skin tearing, but I do not feel it. My ruined knee drags heavily through the black sludge, catching on the uneven rock. Every inch of forward progress requires a monumental, Herculean effort of will against the overwhelming gravity of the poison. The air grows thicker, the smell of roasted timber and burnt flesh becoming so potent it makes my eyes water with stinging tears. The headache is a physical presence now, a spike driven directly through the center of my brain. My vision is narrowing, a creeping tunnel of blackness encroaching from the periphery, leaving only a tiny, wavering circle of sight in the center. I am crawling blindly down the narrow, 3-foot heading, my shoulders scraping the timber props, guided only by the memory of the rock and the desperate, fading instinct to survive. I do not know how far the main gate is. I do not know if the air there will be any better, or if the entire colliery has become a single, massive tomb. The mountain is pressing down, the weight of the miles of rock above me feeling heavier than it ever has, sensing that my strength is finally broken. The ghosts in the smoke drift alongside me, keeping pace in the dark, whispering their sweet, poisonous lullabies into my ears. I close my eyes against the stinging dust, lower my head into the freezing mud, and pull myself 1 inch closer to a dawn I may never see. The forward motion is an atrocity against the anatomy of a man. To drag a ruined, poisoned frame through the jagged gut of the earth without the use of the legs is a lesson in complete mechanical degradation. Every single inch of the narrow heading demands a tithe of flesh. I reach out into the absolute, featureless blackness, my fingers curling into the freezing, silicious muck of the floor, searching for any protrusion of slate or exposed sleeper that might offer purchase. I find a jagged edge of rock, lock my bleeding, carbon-stained knuckles around it, and pull. The friction is agonizing. My forearms and elbows, bearing the entire dead weight of my torso and trailing legs, scrape mercilessly against the uneven shale. The heavy wool of my jacket, already soaked and rotting from the pervasive damp, tears away in sodden strips. Soon, the fabric is gone entirely from the joints, and the unyielding stone begins to work directly against the raw skin. With every excruciating eve forward, I feel the upper layers of my flesh being sanded away, the abrasive coal dust grinding immediately into the fresh, weeping wounds. It is a localized, searing fire that stands in horrific contrast to the freezing chill of the ambient air, a burning that makes my teeth grind together so hard I fear the enamel will shatter. My lower body is entirely useless, a heavy, dead anchor trailing behind me in the sludge. The beat knee, that swollen, fluid-filled sack of agony on my right leg, drags over the sharp stones. I cannot lift it. I cannot protect it. I feel it catching on the edge of a sunken timber, the taut, inflamed skin stretching to the point of tearing. A sickening, muffled pop vibrates through the bone of my thigh, followed instantly by a sudden, hot rush of fluid down my shin. The sack has burst. The relief from the localized pressure lasts for only a fraction of a second before the raw, exposed nerves of the joint are plunged directly into the acidic, mineral-heavy brine of the sump. The pain is so absolute, so blindingly intense, that it momentarily overrides the narcotic, lethargic fog of the afterdamp. I open my mouth to scream, but the only sound that emerges is a wet, desperate wheeze, instantly swallowed by the immense, crushing silence of the tunnel. The silence. As the sharp spike of pain in my knee slowly recedes back into a dull, thudding roar, I realize that the silence of the deep has fundamentally changed. The ringing in my ears, the persistent, high-pitched pit song born from hours of striking the iron pick, has faded, replaced by an auditory void so profound it feels like a physical pressure against the eardrums. But it is not just the absence of the ringing. Something massive is missing from the architecture of the dark. I press my torn cheek against the freezing mud, my chest heaving, and I listen past the frantic, terrifying hammering of my own heart. I listen for the heartbeat of the mine. It is gone. For as long as I have worked this colliery, there has always been the distant, subsonic thump, thump, thump of the great steam pumps at the main shaft. They are the massive iron lungs of the pit, tirelessly sucking the subterranean oceans out of the galleries, fighting a perpetual, desperate war against the Earth's desire to drown us. Even in the furthest, most solitary headings, you could feel their deep, rhythmic vibration in the marrow of your bones. It was a comforting, mechanical assurance that the world above still existed, that men of science and iron were keeping the abyss at bay. Now, there is nothing. The explosion that sent the afterdamp rolling through the workings has done more than destroy the ventilation doors. It has severed the steam lines. It has shattered the iron hearts. The pumps have failed. The realization drops into my gut like a lead weight, heavier and colder than the poison air. Without the pumps, the mine is no longer a workplace. It is a sinking ship trapped 3,000 feet beneath the soil. The groundwater, which has been weeping continuously from the pores of the shale, is no longer being drawn away. The earth is bleeding into the void, and there is nothing to stem the tide. I feel the truth of it before I hear it. The stagnant pool of freezing muck that I am crawling through, the sump that normally covers the floor by an inch or two, is changing its character. It is no longer just a puddle. It is acquiring a current. As I drag my ruined body forward another agonizing foot, the freezing water creeps higher up my chest. It is soaking through the thick woolen shirt, reaching the bare, shivering skin of my ribs. The temperature of this water is a shock to the dying system. It is not the refreshing chill of a surface stream. It is the prehistoric, stagnant cold of the deep earth, a liquid ice that instantly numbs the flesh and sends violent, uncontrollable tremors shuddering through my spine. Then comes the sound. It is a soft, insidious gurgle, a wet, whispering lap of water against the timber props and the jagged coal face. It is the sound of the deep reclaiming its territory. The water is rising. It is pouring out from the unseen fissures, welling up from the abandoned, lower levels of the dip workings, driven by the immense, crushing hydraulic pressure of the miles of rock above. The sensory isolation of the absolute dark makes the rising tide infinitely more terrifying. I cannot see the water level. I can only feel it swallowing me inch by inch. I reach my hand out for the next handhold, and my fingers plunge entirely beneath the freezing surface, scraping against a submerged sleeper. The tunnel I am navigating is barely 3 feet high. If the water rises just 2 feet, it will reach the low, jagged roof of the shale. There will be no air gap. There will be nowhere to breathe. I am suddenly caught in a horrific, impossible paradox, suspended between two distinct methods of execution. If I raise my head to keep my mouth and nose above the freezing, rising tide, I push my face directly into the concentrated, invisible cloud of the afterdamp lingering near the roof. The carbon monoxide is thickest there, a heavy, sweet-smelling fog of roasted timber and burnt flesh that immediately tightens the iron band around my skull and sends my heart into a frantic, fluttering panic. The dizziness washes over me in sickening waves, and the irresistible, narcotic urge to simply close my eyes and surrender to the sweet death pulls at my consciousness. But if I lower my head to escape the worst of the poison, my face dips into the freezing, acidic brine. I swallow mouthfuls of the gritty, coal-laced water, choking and sputtering in the dark. The water tastes of ancient salt, of dissolved iron, and of the foul, rotting fungus that coats the abandoned timbers. It burns the raw, bleeding tissue in the back of my throat, triggering a violent fit of the miner's cough that racks my submerged chest and expels whatever precious little oxygen I have left in my lungs. The crawl becomes a desperate, drowning undulation. I push my head up into the poison, gasping a shallow, ragged breath of the sickening air, feeling the dizziness spike and my vision swim with red, hallucinatory phosphenes. Then, before the carbon monoxide can pull me entirely into unconsciousness, I drop my face back down into the freezing water, shivering violently as the ice-cold tide washes over my ears, sealing out the world. I pull with my bleeding elbows, dragging my paralyzed legs through the submerged slack, advancing another few inches before I am forced to raise my head into the gas again. Up into the fire. Down into the ice. Pull. The rhythm is a grotesque parody of life, a mechanical repetition driven solely by the deepest, most primitive instinct of the brain stem. The man I was, the father, the husband, the thinker, is entirely dead, burned away by the fire damp and dissolved in the deep. I am nothing more than a blind, aquatic lungfish, thrashing weakly in the black mud of a drying pool, fighting an inevitable extinction. The water continues to rise. It is no longer creeping, it is flowing. I can feel the weight of it pressing against my flanks, a heavy, liquid pressure that seeks to lift my dead legs and turn me over. Debris from the explosion begins to drift past me in the pitch-black current. Unseen, unrecognizable shapes bump softly against my shoulders and glide away. A piece of splintered larch wood. A sodden, heavy lump of brattice cloth. And once, something soft, heavy, and covered in coarse, wood hair that rolls against my cheek before the current pulls it away into the void. I do not let my mind dwell on what it was. To think is to invite the madness in completely. The tunnel seems to be shrinking. As the water level rises, the distance between the freezing surface and the jagged, sagging roof diminishes. My helmet scrapes continuously against the stone now, the heavy leather snagging on the sharp protrusions. The claustrophobia is no longer just a psychological terror, it is a physical, measurable reality. The box is closing. I encounter a blockage. My leading, outstretched hand strikes a solid, immovable mass in the dark. I trace it blindly with my numb, bleeding fingers. It is a timber prop, snapped cleanly in half by the pressure of the mountain, the upper section hanging down from the roof like a jagged, wooden stalactite, while the heavy slate of the ceiling is bowed ominously downward behind it. The explosion shockwave, traveling through the bedrock, has accelerated the squeeze. The roof has partially fallen, creating a choke point in the heading. The gap between the fallen slate and the rising water is impossibly narrow. It is perhaps 12 inches of clearance. The rest is submerged in the black, freezing current. I pause, treading the mud, my chin resting directly on the surface of the water, the sweet, burnt reek of the afterdamp filling my nostrils. The cold is seeping deep into my core, slowing my heart, thick and heavy. The urge to simply stop, to lay my cheek down in the water and let the deep earth have its final victory, is overwhelmingly seductive. It would be so easy. Just one deep breath of the brine, a few seconds of panic, and then the eternal, quiet dark. No more pickaxes. No more dust. No more crawling. But from somewhere deep within the ruined architecture of my mind, a final, defiant spark flares to life. It is an irrational, furious anger. I will not be buried like a rat in a flooded pipe. I will not let the mountain consume me without a fight. I take a deep, ragged breath of the poison air, filling my burning lungs until they feel ready to burst. I close my eyes tightly against the black, polluted water. I lower my head, submerge my face entirely into the freezing current, and drive my torn, bleeding shoulders forward into the jagged, submerged gap beneath the fallen stone. The freezing black water swallows my face, an instant, shocking violation of the senses that threatens to stop my failing heart altogether. The cold is absolute. It is a prehistoric, mineral-heavy chill that instantly numbs the lips, paralyzes the jaw, and drives a spike of pure ice directly into the center of the brain. The water invades the ears, sealing out the hollow, echoing acoustics of the tunnel and replacing them with a terrifying, pressurized rushing sound, the roaring of my own blood fighting to circulate in a dying body. I keep my eyes tightly shut against the abrasive, silicious grit suspended in the current, plunging blindly into the submerged gap beneath the fallen slate. My shoulders enter the choke point. The clearance is even tighter than my frantic, groping fingers had mapped. The ceiling here is not flat, it is a jagged, broken maw of fractured shale, hanging downward like a row of shattered teeth. As I drive my torso forward, the stone presses directly into the raw, weeping flesh of my back. There is no protective layer of wool left, only the sensitized, flayed skin meeting the unyielding edge of the mountain. Beneath me, the floor has dissolved into a deep, sucking mire of silt and pulverized coal. My chest plows through this heavy, viscous mud, displacing it with a sickening, liquid friction. I am wedged between the stone and the sludge, a human wedge driven into a crack in the foundation of the world. The air in my lungs, that single, desperate breath of smoke and carbon monoxide I snatched before going under, is already turning to fire. The afterdamp does not sustain the flesh, it poisons it. As the seconds tick by in the freezing, liquid dark, the urge to exhale becomes a violent, physical command from the brain stem. My diaphragm begins to spasm, sharp, involuntary contractions that jolt my entire frame against the jagged roof. I clamp my jaw shut so tightly that the hinges ache, swallowing the foul, metallic water that tries to force its way past my lips. I pull with my bleeding hands, my fingers blindly seeking the next ridge of sunken stone. I advance an inch. 2 inches. The friction of the rock against my spine peels away another layer of skin, but the freezing water instantly numbs the fresh wound, washing the warm blood away into the black current. My dead legs drag behind me, heavy as cast iron, catching on the submerged debris. Then, my progress abruptly stops. I heave forward, but my body does not move. The heavy leather belt strapped around my waist, the last intact piece of my clothing, has caught firmly on a hidden, submerged snag. It is a spike of iron parites, or perhaps a splintered fragment of the fallen timber prop, projecting upward from the floor deep in the muck. It is hooked securely beneath the tough leather, pinning me in the exact center of the submerged squeeze. Panic, pure and crystalline, shatters the lethargic fog of the carbon monoxide. It is the frantic, mindless terror of the trapped animal. I am buried under 1,000,000 tons of rock, submerged in freezing water, pinned by the waist, and my lungs are collapsing. I thrash in the confined space. It is a useless, violent expenditure of my last reserves of energy. I kick out with my useless legs, but they only stir the heavy mud. I push upward with my elbows, trying to lift my torso off the snag, but the jagged slate of the roof instantly bites into my skull, pinning my head down. I am clamped in the jaws of the earth, and the earth is holding its breath. The burning in my chest reaches a crescendo. The body cannot be denied its reflex forever. The throat convulses. My mouth flies open against my will, a silent, underwater scream, and the black, freezing water rushes in. It hits the back of the throat like a handful of crushed glass. The taste is an abomination: ancient salt, dissolved iron, the slick rot of the fungus, and the foul, oily residue of the coal dust. It pours down the trachea, instantly extinguishing the fire in the lungs and replacing it with a heavy, suffocating mass. I am drowning. The realization is not a thought, it is a total, systemic collapse of the world. The darkness behind my eyelids explodes into a brilliant, hallucinatory shower of red and purple sparks as the brain cells begin to die. In that final, suspended fraction of a second, driven by a primal, cellular refusal to perish in the mud, my hands find the iron buckle of the belt. My fingers are numb, clumsy blocks of freezing meat, but the desperation of the dying grants them a fleeting, miraculous dexterity. I fumble with the stiff, waterlogged leather, the metal prong biting into my thumb. With a final, violent jerk that tears the fingernail cleanly from the nail bed, the buckle gives way. The belt slips free. The snag releases its hold. I surge forward with a convulsive, dying kick, my shoulders scraping brutally past the last hanging edge of the slate. I tear myself out of the gap, leaving the belt and a strip of my own flesh pinned beneath the rock. I throw my head upward, my helmet scraping the ceiling, and break the surface. I gasp. The sound of my inhalation is a wet, horrific shriek that echoes in the pitch-black void. I cough violently, expelling a thick, black stream of the foul water from my lungs, the fluid burning my nasal passages and coating my lips in a gritty slime. I retch, my stomach heaving, vomiting the contaminated brine back into the current. I suck in the air, frantic and sobbing, but the air here is still tainted. The sickening, sweet stench of the afterdamp and the roasted timber still hangs heavy just inches above the water, but it is air. It is a reprieve from the liquid grave. As the violent spasms in my chest begin to subside, replaced by a deep, rattling wheeze, I realize that the geography of the mine has fundamentally changed. The roof here is higher. My helmet no longer scrapes the shale when I raise my head. But the water is deeper. Much deeper. My feet, hanging uselessly beneath me, do not touch the bottom. I am treading water in the absolute dark, kept afloat only by the frantic, exhausted paddling of my torn arms. The heavy woolen trousers are dragging me downward, a terrible, saturated weight pulling at my hips. I reach out a blind hand and strike the wall. It is smooth, worn flat by the persistent flow of ancient groundwater, devoid of the jagged, pick-hewn ridges of the upper headings. I trace it, feeling for the familiar, comforting rough bark of a timber support, but there are none. The realization is a cold, creeping horror that matches the temperature of the water. I am in the dip. The dip is the lowest section of the colliery, a natural, subterranean basin where the coal seam plunges downward at a steep angle. It is a place of perpetual shadow, an abandoned, exhausted labyrinth of old workings that flooded years ago when the seam proved too unstable to mine. It is a reservoir of dead water, a place where no miner ever ventures. The explosion, or my own blind, panic crawling, has somehow driven me off the main gate and funneled me down into the drowned belly of the pit. The map of the mine that I have spent a decade carving into my memory, the twists of the drifts, the locations of the ventilation doors, the inclines of the corf rails, is completely useless here. It is washed away in the freezing current. I am floating in a lightless, featureless void, untethered from the world, surrounded by millions of gallons of black water. Without sight, the sensory deprivation is absolute. I cannot tell how vast this flooded chamber is. The echoes of my splashing hands do not bounce back sharply, they seem to roll outward and fade into an infinite, hollow distance. The current is strong here, a steady, invisible hand pushing against my chest, pulling me deeper into the labyrinth. I try to swim against it, to pull myself back toward the narrow gap I just escaped, but I have no orientation. I do not know which direction is backward. I spin in the water, a dizzying, sickening rotation in the pitch black, my hands grasping only empty liquid. The water is a sensory nightmare. It feels thick, almost viscous, heavily laden with the suspended coal dust and the pulverized shale from the explosion. It leaves an oily, greasy film on my skin that cannot be washed away. And it is entirely, terrifyingly silent. The only sounds in the world are the wet, slapping noises of my own desperate struggle to stay afloat and the ragged, whistling intake of my poisoned breath. I let the current take me, conserving the pathetic remnants of my strength. I drift. The darkness presses against my open eyes like a physical blindfold. The cold has moved past my skin, past my muscles, and is now settling deeply into my internal organs. A profound, shaking lethargy begins to pull at my limbs. The effort to keep my chin above the water is becoming monumental. The afterdamp hovering above the surface continues to whisper its narcotic lies into my brain, urging me to stop kicking, to let the heavy will drag me down into the quiet deep. Suddenly, my sweeping arm strikes something solid in the water. It does not feel like the hard, unyielding stone of the wall, nor the rough, splintered grain of a drifting timber prop. It yields slightly to the touch. It is heavy, waterlogged, and wrapped in thick fabric. I freeze, treading water frantically with my other arm, my heart leaping into my throat. The current pushes the object gently against my chest. In the total absence of light, the fingers become the eyes. I reach out, my trembling, blistered hand exploring the unseen mass floating in the pitch black. I feel the rough weave of a woolen jacket, saturated and heavy. I trace the line of a sleeve, following it down through the freezing water. My fingers meet a hand. It is a human hand, stiff and unnaturally swollen, the skin cold and rubbery. The fingers are curled inward, locked in the rigid, claw-like grip of the cadaveric spasm. I feel the thick, familiar calluses on the palm, the deep, ingrained grime of the coal. It is the hand of a pitman. A choked, horrified sob escapes my lips, echoing across the black water. I pull my hand back as if burned, thrashing wildly in the current to distance myself from the floating corpse. But the current is not just a river, it is a conveyor belt of the dead. The blowout in the upper galleries has swept the casualties of the explosion into the main drainage channels, funneling them down into the flooded dip. Another object bumps against my hip, then another against my shoulder. I am surrounded. The water is thick with them. They drift silently in the absolute dark, a macabre armada of bloated, unseen shapes bumping gently against one another in the slow current. I can feel the movement of the water displacing around them, the heavy, waterlogged mass of their bodies creating subtle eddies that brush against my shivering skin. The psychological dam finally breaks. The isolation, the darkness, the poison, the physical agony, and the tactile horror of treading water in a mass grave combine into a singular, mind-shattering wave of madness. I scream. I scream into the pitch-black void, or raw, tearing sound that shreds the last intact tissues of my throat. I scream for the sun, I scream for the dry earth, I scream for the deaf, unyielding mountain to simply crush me and end the torture. But the mountain does not answer. The dead do not answer. There is only the echo of my own broken voice, bouncing off the unseen walls, returning to me as a mocking, hollow wail, The current continues to pull me, my hands striking the floating corpses as I thrash, drifting deeper into the sunless, drowned catacombs of the earth, where time has stopped and the water has no bottom. The scream tears the last intact lining of my throat, reducing my voice to a wet, metallic rasp that is instantly absorbed by the immense, flooded cavern. The acoustic deadness of the black water swallows the sound, refusing to let it echo, suffocating my panic in a heavy, liquid blanket. I am left with nothing but the burning in my chest and the horrific, tactile reality of the things drifting against me in the dark. But the capacity for pure terror is finite. The human mind can only sustain the jagged edge of absolute panic for so long before the biology of the body intervenes, and in this sunless, subterranean ocean, the biology is being dismantled not by fear, but by the cold.
We have reached the end of our journey for tonight, but the peaceful world we've built will stay with you until the moment you wake. You are completely relaxed now, ready for a deep, restorative rest. Thank you for spending your evening here at the Night Library Archive. If this journey brought you peace, please support us by liking the video and subscribing to our archive. Don't forget to share in the comments which lands you'd like to visit in our next journey. Now, let yourself go into the arms of the night and the silence. Sleep well, and sweet dreams.